Some of history's most revealing evidence still lies in places where time has left its deepest mark. Massive stones remain precisely fitted, ancient landscapes preserve deliberate patterns, and artifacts endure long after the people who created them disappeared from the record. Each discovery offers a fragment of a much larger story, yet some fragments refuse to align. High in western Bolivia, where the Altiplano stretches beneath an immense blue sky, the ground around Nevado Sajama carries a remarkable network of lines that can seem almost impossible from the air. The landscape is immense and austere. Volcanic peaks rise from a broad plateau, vegetation is sparse, and the horizon can extend for extraordinary distances. Yet, across this seemingly empty terrain, countless remarkably straight paths run through the earth, converging, diverging, and continuing across slopes and plains. Known as the Sajama Lines, these geoglyphs are associated with the region surrounding Nevado Sajama, Bolivia's highest mountain. They are not carved deeply into the ground. Instead, their appearance comes largely from the removal or displacement of the dark surface material, exposing lighter soil beneath. Some lines extend for many kilometers, maintaining an unusual degree of straightness despite crossing uneven terrain. From ground level, individual lines can be difficult to recognize. A person standing beside one may simply see a narrow alteration in the surface. Their full scale becomes apparent from elevated viewpoints and aerial imagery, where hundreds or thousands of paths form an intricate network across the plateau. Their origins are generally attributed to indigenous communities who occupied the region before European contact, although precisely when particular lines were created remains difficult to establish. Their construction required no sophisticated machinery. The surface could be cleared using simple tools and repeated human effort. The remarkable feature, therefore, is not necessarily the technology involved, but the organization and persistence required to establish such long, deliberate routes. This raises a more subtle archaeological problem. What were these lines actually for? One interpretation connects them with pilgrimage and sacred movement. Researchers have suggested that the lines may have linked significant locations, including settlements, sacred places, burial sites, or natural landmarks. In this reading, the landscape itself became a kind of ceremonial map, guiding movement through a sacred environment. The lines may have been experienced not as abstract geometric patterns, but as roots with cultural and religious meaning. Other interpretations have considered relationships between the lines and mountains, water sources, settlements, or astronomical observations. The Andes contain numerous traditions in which mountains and landscapes possess profound spiritual significance. So, the possibility that the Sajama network reflected a structured understanding of the surrounding environment remains compelling. Yet, there is an important distinction between possibility and proof. Not every line necessarily served the same function, and the enormous scale of the network makes a single explanation difficult to establish. Some paths appear to connect distant points with striking directness, while others intersect or extend toward locations whose significance is no longer obvious. Without written records from the communities that created them, archaeologists must reconstruct intention from the physical evidence itself. That absence of direct testimony has also allowed more speculative theories to emerge. Some have proposed that the lines formed an enormous system of navigation, while others have suggested that they represented large-scale territorial or cosmological diagrams. More fringe interpretations have occasionally portrayed them as evidence of knowledge or capabilities far beyond what is generally accepted for their period. There is, however, no reliable archaeological evidence requiring such explanations. The more intriguing possibility may be considerably more human. These lines could represent the physical expression of a worldview in which movement, geography, ritual, and the sacred landscape were inseparable. A route across the earth might have been more than a route. It could have been part of a ceremony, a journey, or a connection between places carrying meanings now difficult to recover. And still, the full purpose of the Sajama Lines remains uncertain. Their scale is visible, their construction can be studied, and their presence can be traced across the landscape. But the intentions behind them remain partly beyond reach. As the lines disappear toward distant mountains and continue across the vast Altiplano, the question persists: how much of the meaning once embedded in this extraordinary landscape has yet to be understood? From the vast lines etched into the Bolivian Altiplano, our journey now moves to a very different landscape, where the evidence is no longer spread across the earth as immense pathways, but concentrated in hundreds of heavy stone vessels scattered through the hills of northeastern India. In the remote highlands of Assam and neighboring Meghalaya, forests and grasslands conceal clusters of enormous stone jars, unlike almost anything else found in South Asia. Some stand upright like weathered containers abandoned in place, while others lie broken among the vegetation. Their surfaces are worn by centuries of exposure, their openings dark against the surrounding stone, and their original contents have long since disappeared. These are the megalithic jars of Assam, associated particularly with the region around the Dima Hasao district and with nearby areas of Meghalaya. Archaeological investigations have identified hundreds of examples, sometimes grouped together across elevated landscapes. The jars vary considerably in shape and size. Some are tall and narrow, while others are broad and rounded, with carefully formed rims and hollow interiors. Their presence immediately raises a practical question. Why would communities invest such effort in creating enormous stone vessels in remote terrain? The answer remains uncertain. Archaeological evidence indicates that the jars were intentionally manufactured rather than being natural rock formations. Their surfaces were shaped and smoothed, suggesting considerable labor and knowledge of stoneworking. Yet, the communities responsible for producing them left few written records that can clearly explain their purpose. Several possibilities have been proposed. One interpretation connects the jars with funerary practices. Human remains have been discovered in or around some comparable jar traditions elsewhere in Southeast Asia, and local oral traditions have preserved memories of mortuary customs involving large stone vessels. In this interpretation, the Assam jars may have been associated with burial, secondary burial, or rituals connected with the treatment of the dead. But the archaeological evidence is not uniform enough to settle the matter completely. Some jars appear to have been placed in locations where their arrangement may have carried social or ceremonial significance. Others stand individually or in small groups, making their original function difficult to reconstruct. Were they containers for human remains? Were they connected with ritual feasting, food storage, or some other practice that has left little physical trace? The landscape itself may offer another clue. Many of the jar sites occupy elevated areas overlooking valleys and surrounding terrain. Their placement does not appear entirely random. From certain locations, the relationship between the stone vessels, hills, and distant horizons becomes especially striking. This has encouraged researchers to consider whether the sites were connected to routes of movement, territorial boundaries, ceremonial landscapes, or particular places of cultural importance. There is also a broader regional puzzle. Large stone jars are known from several parts of Southeast Asia, including Laos and the northeastern Indian region. Although similarities do not automatically prove contact between distant communities, the existence of these traditions raises questions about how ideas, customs, and technologies traveled through ancient landscapes. Could communities separated by great distances have shared related practices? Or did different societies independently arrive at similar solutions for ritual or practical needs? More speculative interpretations have gone further, proposing connections between the jar fields and lost migration routes or unknown prehistoric cultures. Such ideas remain difficult to substantiate, particularly because direct chronological evidence is limited, and many sites have suffered from natural deterioration, looting, or disturbance. Yet, the absence of a definitive explanation does not diminish the significance of what remains. Each massive vessel represents a deliberate transformation of stone into an object with a purpose. Someone selected the material, shaped it, transported it, and positioned it within a landscape. Generations may have returned to these places, maintaining traditions whose meanings eventually slipped beyond the surviving archaeological record. Today, the jars remain silent among the hills of Assam, their empty interiors offering no simple answer. Their makers left behind stone, arrangement, and fragments of evidence, but not an explanation. And as researchers continue examining these enigmatic sites, one question remains quietly unresolved. What ceremony, belief, or forgotten custom once gave these immense stone vessels their meaning? In the highlands of central Sulawesi, Indonesia, the Bada Valley unfolds between steep green mountains, dense vegetation, and broad agricultural clearings. Scattered through this secluded landscape are enormous stone figures, weathered by centuries of rain and sunlight. Some are little more than roughly shaped slabs, while others bear unmistakable human features: rounded heads, prominent eyes, simplified mouths, and elongated bodies rising from the earth. These are the megaliths of the Bada Valley, part of a wider tradition of monumental stone construction found throughout central Sulawesi. They are among the most striking archaeological remains in the region, yet their exact age, purpose, and cultural significance remain difficult to establish with certainty. The figures can appear almost familiar at first glance. Their proportions suggest human beings, but their expressions are highly stylized. Some stand alone, while others are associated with stone vessels, slabs, burial structures, or arrangements of smaller stones. Their creators clearly intended these monuments to occupy particular places within the landscape. But why? The valley offers few written records from the communities responsible for constructing them. Archaeologists therefore rely on the stones themselves, their archaeological surroundings, local traditions, and comparisons with other megalithic sites throughout Sulawesi. One widely accepted interpretation connects the monuments with ancestral beliefs and funerary practices. In many societies, monumental stones served as physical representations of important individuals or as markers associated with the dead. The Bada Valley's stone figures may likewise have commemorated ancestors, leaders, or people whose social importance extended beyond their lifetime. Nearby, stone features provide additional clues. Some resemble large basins or containers carved from single blocks of rock. These objects have sometimes been associated with mortuary activity, although their precise functions are not always clear. Taken together, the monuments suggest that death, remembrance, status, and the physical landscape may have been closely connected. Yet, dating these structures presents a considerable challenge. The tropical environment can erase archaeological evidence rapidly. Organic materials decay, surfaces weather, and later communities may alter earlier sites. As a result, assigning precise dates to individual monuments is often difficult. Estimates have varied, and the chronology of the broader megalithic tradition remains an active subject of research. This uncertainty has encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some observers have proposed that the monuments may represent a much older cultural tradition than the surviving evidence currently demonstrates. Others have suggested connections between the Bada Valley and megalithic practices elsewhere in Southeast Asia. Similarities in monumental architecture can be intriguing, but resemblance alone cannot establish contact or common ancestry. More adventurous theories have occasionally suggested that the stones belong to a sophisticated culture that disappeared without leaving recognizable settlements or written records. such proposals remain unconfirmed. Archaeology has not produced evidence requiring an unknown civilization to explain the monuments. The more compelling puzzle may lie in something simpler: the persistence of an idea. At some point, people living in these mountains decided that particular stones should be transformed into representations of human beings. They selected enormous blocks, shaped them with labor-intensive techniques, transported or repositioned them when necessary, and placed them within a landscape that must have carried deep significance. What did those figures represent to the people who stood before them? An ancestor watching over a community, a monument marking the presence of the dead, a symbol of authority, or part of a ritual system whose meaning depended upon ceremonies that left no durable trace. Today, the figures remain exposed beneath the tropical sky, their features gradually softened by time. They offer no inscription explaining their purpose, and no surviving record identifies the people who first gave them form. Their silence is precisely what makes the Bada Valley so compelling. The stones are tangible evidence of human intention, yet the intention itself remains incomplete. Somewhere between the monument and the memory, it was created to preserve lies a story that archaeology has only partially recovered. And among these remote mountains, that unfinished story still waits to be understood. On the edge of the Loess Plateau in northern China, the landscape around Shimao rises in layers of dry earth and rugged stone. Here, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of a vast, fortified settlement extending across roughly 400 hectares. Its walls follow the contours of the terrain, while massive stone structures, terraces, towers, and gates reveal a level of construction that was once almost entirely unknown to the modern world. Known as Shimao, the site dates primarily to the late Neolithic period, around 2300 to 1800 BC. For generations, the remains were not understood as belonging to such a significant settlement. Only through systematic archaeological investigation did the scale of the complex become clear. Shimao was not simply a village enclosed by a wall. Its architecture included an inner enclosure, an outer fortified zone, monumental terraces, and carefully constructed stone defenses. Some walls were reinforced with sophisticated arrangements of stone and timber, while elevated platforms appear to have played important ceremonial or political roles. The sheer amount of labor involved is difficult to overlook. Thousands of tons of stone had to be quarried, transported, shaped, and assembled across uneven ground. The settlement also occupied a strategically elevated position, providing broad views over the surrounding landscape. From its walls, movement through the valleys could have been monitored from considerable distances. Why would a community living more than 4,000 years ago invest so heavily in fortifications? The conventional explanation points toward social complexity and regional conflict. Shimao emerged during a period of major cultural change in northern China, when communities were developing increasingly elaborate forms of political organization. Defensive architecture suggests that security mattered, whether because of competition over resources, territorial disputes, or conflicts between neighboring groups. But the archaeological evidence reveals something more complicated. Within the site, researchers have found remarkable carved jade objects, elaborate architectural features, and evidence of ritual activity. Even more unsettling are discoveries involving human remains. Numerous human skulls were found associated with sections of the fortifications, including evidence suggesting that some individuals may have been killed and their remains deliberately placed during construction. Such findings have raised difficult questions about violence, ritual sacrifice, warfare, and political authority. Were these people enemies captured during conflict? Were their deaths part of ceremonies intended to protect the walls? Or did their placement carry another symbolic meaning that cannot now be reconstructed? The stonework itself offers further clues. Some sections of the walls contain carefully arranged blocks that demonstrate considerable engineering skill. Unlike later monumental Chinese architecture built largely in other materials, Shimao's defenses were constructed predominantly from stone, reflecting adaptation to the local environment and the resources available to its builders. For decades, the site's significance was underestimated partly because traditional historical narratives placed the emergence of major urban centers elsewhere. Shimao complicates that picture. It demonstrates that complex, fortified societies existed in northern China centuries before the better documented dynastic states traditionally associated with the development of early Chinese civilization. This has led to broader speculation. Some researchers have considered whether Shimao represented an independent regional center that developed its own political and religious traditions. Others have examined possible connections between Shimao and neighboring archaeological cultures through trade, migration, or technological exchange. More speculative interpretations have attempted to connect the site with later legendary traditions, or propose that its builders possessed knowledge far more advanced than expected for their period. There is currently no evidence requiring such explanations. The engineering, however impressive, can be understood through organized labor, accumulated experience, and sophisticated social coordination. And perhaps that is what makes Shimao most compelling. The mystery is not how people could possibly have built it. Human communities have repeatedly demonstrated extraordinary abilities when resources, authority, and shared beliefs converge. The deeper question is what kind of society could organize thousands of people around a fortified center of this scale, and what pressures drove them to construct walls that would dominate the surrounding landscape for generations. Shimao eventually declined, and the settlement ceased to function as the powerful center it once was. Its walls remained, gradually absorbed into the surrounding terrain until archaeology began revealing their true extent. Today, the stone city offers fragments of a society that possessed wealth, hierarchy, craftsmanship, ritual traditions, and perhaps a persistent fear of conflict. Yet, the people who planned its defenses left no written account explaining their motives. Among those immense stone walls, the architecture survives more clearly than the voices of its builders. And the unanswered question remains: what was happening inside Shimao that made such formidable walls necessary in the first place? Across the rugged landscapes of AlUla in northwestern Saudi Arabia, long stone structures stretch across the desert floor like enormous geometric markings. Built from low walls of roughly arranged stones, many form elongated rectangles that can extend for hundreds of meters. From ground level, their shapes can be difficult to comprehend. From above, however, their deliberate design becomes unmistakable. These structures are known as mustatils, an Arabic term meaning rectangles. Thousands have been identified across northwestern Arabia, making them one of the most extensive archaeological phenomena in the region. Their scale is remarkable, but their age makes them even more significant. Archaeological research indicates that many mustatils were constructed during the late Neolithic period, roughly between 7,000 and 5,000 BC. This means they predate the pyramids of Egypt by several thousand years, and belong to a period when communities in Arabia were living through profound environmental and cultural changes. At first glance, the structures seem remarkably simple. Two parallel walls extend across the landscape, connected by shorter walls at either end, creating a long rectangular enclosure. Some contain internal compartments or additional features. Others include large stone platforms, standing stones, or areas that appear to have been deliberately arranged. But what were they for? For many years, their purpose remained uncertain. Their immense number and widespread distribution suggested that they were unlikely to have been ordinary settlements or defensive structures. There are no substantial roofs, domestic buildings, or obvious signs that people lived inside them permanently. Recent excavations have provided important clues. At several Mustatils, archaeologists have identified evidence of ritual activity, including animal remains and structures that appear to have been associated with ceremonial practices. Some deposits contain cattle horns and skull fragments, suggesting that cattle may have played a symbolic role. This is particularly significant because the Arabian environment of the period was not always as arid as it is today. During parts of the early Holocene, rainfall was considerably greater, creating grasslands, wetlands, and seasonal lakes across regions that are now dominated by desert. Communities could support herds of cattle and other animals, moving through a landscape that was much more hospitable than the modern environment suggests. Could the Mustatils have been gathering places connected with pastoral rituals? That interpretation has gained considerable support. Their construction may have brought communities together for ceremonies involving animals, offerings, feasting, or collective identity. The structures could have served as monumental spaces where people expressed relationships between humans, animals, ancestors, and the landscape. Yet, important uncertainties remain. The Mustatils differ from one another. Some are enormous, while others are comparatively small. Their internal arrangements vary, and not every structure has produced the same archaeological evidence. It is therefore difficult to assume that every Mustatil served an identical function. Some researchers have also considered whether the structures marked particular landscapes or routes used by mobile communities. Others have explored connections between the monuments and broader changes in climate, animal husbandry, and social organization. More speculative interpretations have suggested astronomical functions or symbolic relationships with mountains and celestial events. Such possibilities are intriguing, but the evidence remains insufficient to establish them as fact. What is becoming increasingly clear is that these structures were not random accumulations of stone. Their builders invested substantial labor in creating monuments that could survive for thousands of years. The effort required to establish long walls across difficult terrain implies organization, cooperation, and a shared reason for undertaking the work. And that raises a deeper question. Why create monuments on such an enormous scale in a landscape where communities were constantly adapting to changing environmental conditions? Perhaps the answer lies in collective memory. A Mustatil could have provided a fixed place within a mobile world, a location where people returned, performed rituals, gathered with neighboring groups, and reinforced connections that were otherwise difficult to maintain. But the desert preserves only fragments of those events. The people who constructed these monuments left no written explanation of their beliefs, and many of the rituals that once gave the structures meaning have disappeared with them. What remains are the walls, the animal remains, the carefully arranged stones, and an immense archaeological landscape stretching far beyond any single site. Seen from above, the Mustatils form a quiet geometric presence across AlUla, linking distant places through a tradition whose full meaning is still being reconstructed. And as researchers continue to uncover what lies within these ancient rectangles, another question remains suspended over the desert. How much of the world these monuments once represented has yet to be recovered? Across the open steppes of Mongolia, the horizon seems almost endless. Grasslands roll toward distant mountains, the wind moves freely across the plains, and beneath the enormous sky, isolated stone pillars stand among the remnants of ancient burial grounds. Many are tall, narrow slabs of granite or sandstone, their surfaces worn by centuries of exposure. Yet, when the light falls across them at an angle, details emerge. Deer appear to race across the stone, their bodies elongated into elegant curves, antlers extending high above their heads. Alongside them are images of birds, circular forms, weapons, belts, shields, and other objects. These monuments are known as deer stones, and together they represent one of the most distinctive artistic traditions of the Bronze Age Eurasian steppe. Most deer stones date broadly to the late 2nd millennium BC and early 1st millennium BC, although precise dates vary between regions and individual monuments. They are concentrated particularly in Mongolia, with related examples extending into areas of southern Siberia and Central Asia. Their distribution alone is remarkable. The monuments stand in landscapes that once supported mobile pastoral communities, people whose lives were closely connected to horses, livestock, seasonal movement, and the open terrain. Unlike permanent stone cities, these societies left relatively few monumental buildings. The deer stones therefore provide an unusually direct glimpse into a world whose material remains can otherwise be difficult to reconstruct. But their purpose is not entirely clear. Many deer stones have been found in association with burial mounds, stone circles, ceremonial structures, and other monuments. Some appear to have been deliberately placed within larger ritual landscapes. Others were later moved or incorporated into new constructions, making their original positions difficult to determine. The carved imagery offers perhaps the strongest clues. The deer are usually depicted with sweeping bodies and exaggerated antlers, often appearing to move upward across the surface of the stone. Their representation is so consistent that researchers believe the imagery followed a recognizable symbolic tradition rather than simply depicting animals encountered in daily life. Why deer? The animal may have carried religious or cosmological significance. In steppe societies, animals could occupy an important place within ritual systems, and the extraordinary stylization of the deer suggests that these were more than ordinary hunting scenes. Some researchers have proposed connections with beliefs concerning transformation, the journey of the dead, or movement between different realms of existence. Other interpretations focus on the monuments as memorials to individuals of elevated status. Weapons and belts carved onto the stones may represent warriors or leaders. Some stones contain images resembling daggers, axes, bows, or shields, while others show ornaments that may have identified particular social roles. If so, the deer stones could have functioned as representations of people whose importance extended beyond their lifetime. But even this interpretation leaves questions. Were the figures portraits of actual individuals, or symbolic representations of a social or spiritual identity? Did the carved weapons belong to the person commemorated, or were they conventional symbols? And why were deer given such prominence compared with human figures? The answers may lie in the relationship between the imagery and the surrounding landscape. Many deer stones were placed in areas containing burial monuments and ceremonial features. Some stand within broad stone arrangements that appear to have been carefully planned. The placement suggests that the monuments were components of larger ritual environments rather than isolated works of art. The people who created them were also capable of remarkable stoneworking. A typical deer stone had to be selected, transported, shaped, and raised into position. In a mobile pastoral society, moving a large stone over considerable distances would have required coordinated labor and careful planning. The monument therefore represents not only an artistic statement, but also an organized communal effort. That is significant because the steppes can easily create the impression of isolation. The archaeological record suggests something different. Communities were connected through movement, exchange, shared artistic traditions, and perhaps political alliances. Similar motifs appear across enormous distances, indicating that ideas could travel between groups even when settlements were widely separated. Some researchers have therefore examined the deer stones as evidence for broader cultural networks extending across Inner Asia. More speculative theories have taken these connections further, proposing that the monuments reflect migrations of warrior groups or the movement of religious concepts across the Eurasian steppe. Others have suggested that certain motifs encode astronomical ideas, with the carved forms representing celestial bodies or cosmological events. Such interpretations remain debated. There are certainly reasons to examine astronomical possibilities. The people who lived on the steppe possessed an intimate awareness of seasonal cycles, the movement of animals, and the changing sky. But identifying a particular carved symbol as an astronomical representation requires evidence beyond visual resemblance. The same caution applies to theories connecting deer stones with later steppe traditions. Mongolia would eventually become associated with powerful nomadic confederations, and much later with the Mongol Empire. It is tempting to connect every earlier monument with these later societies, but the chronology does not support a simple continuous narrative. The deer stones belong to a much earlier cultural setting, and their creators should be understood on their own terms. Their relationship with burial practices is equally complex. Some associated graves contain human remains and objects that indicate differences in status. Yet, not every deer stone can be directly connected to a single burial. Some may have been erected independently or reused in later ceremonies. Their meanings may therefore have changed over time. This possibility introduces another layer to the archaeological puzzle. A monument can outlive the society that created it. Later communities may encounter an ancient stone, recognize its importance, and incorporate it into their own rituals without fully understanding its original purpose. A carved figure can acquire new meanings while its physical form remains unchanged. The deer stones may have experienced precisely this kind of long cultural life. Their surfaces preserve weapons, ornaments, animals, and abstract symbols, but they do not preserve the ceremonies that once surrounded them. The voices of the people who raised these monuments are absent, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct their world through fragments of stone and earth. Today, many of these pillars still stand beneath the enormous Mongolian sky, their carved deer appearing to move across surfaces worn smooth by time. They remain remarkably expressive, yet their symbolism refuses to yield a single definitive interpretation. Perhaps they honored warriors. Perhaps they marked ancestors. Perhaps they formed part of ceremonies concerning death, identity, and the natural world. Or perhaps several meanings existed simultaneously, depending upon the community and the monument. The evidence allows several possibilities, but certainty remains elusive. And so the deer stones continue to occupy an unusual place in the archaeological record. Monumental enough to command attention, detailed enough to reveal a sophisticated symbolic tradition, yet silent about the beliefs that gave those images their deepest meaning. Standing before one today, the stone reveals what its makers chose to carve, but not why those particular images mattered so profoundly. Somewhere between the carved deer, the surrounding burial grounds, and the immense steppe landscape lies a system of beliefs that has never been completely recovered. What remains may be only the visible surface of a much larger story, still waiting to be pieced together from stone. On a barren ridge overlooking the coastal valleys of northern Peru, 12 massive stone towers rise in a carefully arranged line. The surrounding landscape is stark: dry hills, pale earth, and a distant horizon stretching toward the Pacific. There are no forests to obscure the view, and almost no modern structures interrupt the ancient arrangement. These are the solar towers of Chankillo, constructed roughly around 300 BC, during a period when organized societies were already developing sophisticated architectural and ceremonial traditions along the Peruvian coast. Chankillo consists of a fortified complex, ceremonial buildings, and, most famously, a sequence of 12 towers positioned along a low ridge. Their arrangement is what makes the site extraordinary. Viewed from specific observation points, the towers appear to mark successive positions along the horizon where the sun rises or sets throughout the year. At certain times, the sun emerges near one end of the row. As the seasons progress, its position gradually shifts, appearing farther along the line. Over the course of the annual cycle, the towers provide a series of recognizable reference points. The effect is subtle but powerful. A landscape that appears empty suddenly becomes a kind of astronomical calendar. For communities living in an environment where agriculture depended upon seasonal rhythms, the ability to track the movement of the sun could have had practical value. The annual solar cycle influenced planting, harvesting, ceremonies, and the organization of time. Chankillo, therefore, may have served as an instrument through which people could observe and structure the year. But the architecture suggests that something more than simple observation may have been involved. The complex includes substantial defensive walls and entrances, as well as ceremonial structures and areas associated with controlled movement through the site. This combination of astronomy, architecture, and restricted spaces raises questions about who was permitted to observe the sun from particular locations. Were these observations part of religious ceremonies? Were they used by specialists who held authority over the calendar? Or did the towers serve several functions simultaneously? Archaeological evidence cannot yet provide a complete answer. The civilization responsible for Chankillo is often referred to as the Chankillo culture, although many details about the society itself remain uncertain. The builders clearly possessed considerable organizational ability. Constructing 12 substantial towers and coordinating them with observation points required planning, labor, surveying, and an understanding of the changing solar horizon. The precision becomes especially apparent when the towers are viewed from the correct positions. The spaces between them are not simply decorative. They create a sequence of horizon markers. The rising sun moves through these positions in a predictable annual pattern, allowing observers to recognize different stages of the solar year. In this sense, Chankillo may represent one of the earliest known monumental solar observatories in the Americas. That distinction matters. Ancient peoples across the world observed celestial movements, but Chankillo demonstrates how astronomical knowledge could be embedded directly into architecture. The structure did not merely provide a place from which to watch the sky. The building itself transformed the horizon into a measurable sequence. Yet, even with this interpretation, important questions remain. Why 12 towers? The number immediately invites comparison with the 12 months of a solar year, but the correspondence should be treated cautiously. The towers do not function as a simple one-to-one calendar in every interpretation, and ancient timekeeping systems do not necessarily correspond to modern divisions of the year. Another possibility is that the towers represented a broader ceremonial understanding of seasonal change rather than a precise calendar. The fortified character of the site adds another layer. Chankillo was not simply a line of towers standing alone. The surrounding complex contains walls, courtyards, and structures that suggest controlled access and organized activity. Some areas appear to have been designed to channel movement toward particular locations. If astronomical observation was important, perhaps access to the observations themselves was also socially significant. A person who could predict the seasonal movement of the sun might possess knowledge with practical and symbolic power. Such expertise could influence agricultural decisions, ceremonial schedules, and political authority. This idea remains plausible, but direct evidence is limited. There are no surviving texts explaining the site's purpose. No ancient inscription tells us who stood at the observation points or what ceremonies accompanied the changing sunlight. Researchers must reconstruct the site's function from architecture, astronomical alignments, artifacts, and comparisons with other Andean traditions. More speculative interpretations have sometimes suggested that Chankillo encoded a highly sophisticated cosmology extending beyond simple solar observation. Some have proposed relationships between the towers, religious ceremonies, and broader ideas about cosmic order. These theories are difficult to test. The strongest evidence remains the physical alignment itself. The towers demonstrably correspond with the changing position of the sun along the horizon, making astronomical observation one of the most compelling explanations for their design. Yet, knowing how the system worked does not necessarily tell us why it mattered. A modern observer can stand at the appropriate point and watch sunlight appear between the towers, but the experience would have been profoundly different for the people who constructed the monument. For them, the movement of the sun may have been inseparable from agriculture, authority, ritual, and the structure of their society. Each sunrise would have carried information. The changing position of the sun could signal a particular season, confirm the passage of the year, and perhaps indicate when certain communal activities should begin. The architecture transformed these subtle celestial changes into something visible and tangible. And then, at some point, the complex ceased to function in the way its builders intended. The reasons remain uncertain. Political change, environmental pressures, conflict, shifting settlement patterns, or transformations in religious practice may all have played a role. The archaeological record does not provide a single explanation. The towers, however, remained. For centuries, they endured on the ridge, exposed to the harsh coastal climate, until modern archaeology began to reveal their astronomical significance. What had once appeared to be an enigmatic row of stone structures emerged as evidence of deliberate observation and sophisticated understanding of the solar cycle. Yet, the more we understand about Chankillo, the more subtle the remaining questions become. Who possessed the knowledge necessary to design it? How was that knowledge transmitted? What ceremonies accompanied the changing positions of the sun? And did the towers serve primarily as an astronomical instrument, a ceremonial monument, a political symbol, or some combination of all three? The stones provide an extraordinary answer to one question. The builders were carefully watching the sky. They offer no equally clear answer about what those observations meant to the people who stood there thousands of years ago. And as the sun continues to trace the same ancient path across the Peruvian horizon, passing the towers one by one, Chankillo remains a remarkable reminder that astronomical knowledge can survive long after the society that created it has faded from the archaeological record. The mechanism can be reconstructed. The meaning is harder to recover. What else might those 12 towers have been telling the people who built them? In the central highlands of Ethiopia, south of Addis Ababa, the landscape around Tiya is green during the rainy season and dry beneath the intense highland sun at other times of the year. Low hills rise around cultivated fields, while scattered stone monuments stand in carefully arranged groups. Among them are dozens of tall, narrow stelae. Some are plain and weathered. Others carry distinctive carved symbols, curved forms resembling swords, circular motifs, and abstract markings whose original significance remains uncertain. These are the Tiya Stelae, part of a wider tradition of monumental stone construction found throughout southern Ethiopia. The site is generally dated to the first half of the 2nd millennium AD, although establishing a precise chronology for individual monuments remains difficult. Archaeological research has identified the stelae as part of a broader cultural landscape containing burial sites and other forms of megalithic architecture. Their appearance is immediately striking. Unlike monuments covered with lengthy inscriptions, the Tiya stones communicate through a small vocabulary of repeated symbols. The most recognizable motif is a shape often described as a sword or dagger. Some stones also display circular or plant-like forms, while others contain patterns that have resisted confident interpretation. Who carved them? And what did those symbols mean to the people who stood before them? The archaeological evidence points toward a connection with funerary practices. Excavations around the region have revealed graves associated with megalithic monuments, suggesting that these stones may have marked burial grounds or commemorated individuals. This interpretation is plausible, but the precise relationship between the stelae and the people buried nearby remains difficult to establish. A monument beside a grave does not necessarily tell us whether it represented the deceased, marked their social status, identified a family group, or served a broader ritual purpose. The uncertainty becomes even greater when the symbols themselves are considered. The repeated sword-like carvings have attracted considerable attention. Some researchers have interpreted them as weapons, perhaps indicating warriors or individuals of elevated status. Others have suggested that the shapes may be symbolic rather than literal representations of physical objects. A sword carved into stone could commemorate a warrior. It could represent authority. It could symbolize death, protection, or another concept that has no direct equivalent in modern interpretation. Without written explanations from the builders, each possibility must be tested against the archaeological evidence. The circular motifs create another layer of uncertainty. They have sometimes been interpreted as representations of the sun, eyes, shields, or other symbolic forms. Yet, none of these interpretations can be established with complete certainty. This is one of the enduring difficulties of prehistoric archaeology. A modern observer naturally searches for familiar shapes. Once a carving resembles a weapon, an animal, or a celestial object, the human mind tends to assign meaning to it. Archaeologists must therefore distinguish between what a symbol resembles and what its creators intended it to represent. The wider landscape may provide more reliable clues. Tiya is not an isolated monument. The surrounding region contains numerous megalithic sites, including groups of stelae, burial structures, and other stone arrangements. Together, these monuments suggest that communities in southern Ethiopia maintained traditions of commemorating the dead and organizing significant places through carefully positioned stones. The scale of the tradition is important. The construction of large stone monuments required coordinated labor. Stones had to be selected, shaped, transported, and raised. Even relatively simple stelae represented a substantial communal investment. Why devote that effort to commemorating people whose names and identities have disappeared? Perhaps the answer lies in social memory. In societies without written records, monuments could preserve the presence of individuals or groups through physical form. A stone could establish a connection between a person and a particular landscape, allowing their memory to persist through generations. But perhaps the monuments served a wider function. They may have helped define sacred spaces, reinforce community identity, or express relationships between living people and their ancestors. The repeated symbols could have communicated ideas that were widely understood within the society, even if their meanings are now inaccessible. More speculative interpretations have occasionally suggested that the Tiya carvings represent an unknown writing system or encode astronomical information. Others have looked for connections with distant megalithic traditions elsewhere in Africa. Such theories remain difficult to demonstrate. There is currently no established evidence that the Tiya symbols constitute a written language. Nor is there convincing proof that the stones were designed primarily as astronomical instruments. Their strongest archaeological associations remain funerary and ceremonial. Yet, the possibility of a more complex symbolic system cannot simply be dismissed because its meaning is unfamiliar. The problem is that the original cultural context has been fragmented. The people who created the monuments left no surviving written account describing their beliefs. Oral traditions may preserve memories of monumental practices, but connecting later traditions directly to the original builders requires caution. Centuries of cultural change can transform the meaning of a place while leaving its stones standing. This creates a fascinating tension. The physical monuments are remarkably durable, while the meanings attached to them may have been fragile. A carved symbol can survive for 1,000 years. The ritual knowledge needed to interpret it may disappear within a few generations. Today, the Tiya Stelae still stand in the Ethiopian highlands, their surfaces carrying the same abstract forms that once communicated something important to their creators. We can study the stone, examine the graves, compare the motifs, and reconstruct aspects of the society that produced them. But the central message remains uncertain. Were the sword-like forms memorials to warriors? Were the circles symbols of a religious worldview? Did each monument represent an individual, a lineage, or a collective memory? And how much of the original meaning has been lost simply because the people who understood these signs are no longer here to explain them? The Tiya stones offer no inscription that resolves the question. Instead, they leave us with repeated symbols carved into weathered stone, standing quietly within a landscape that has changed many times since their creation. Their builders clearly intended these monuments to communicate something enduring. What that message was, however, remains only partly within reach, and somewhere between the graves, the carvings, and the highland landscape, a forgotten system of meaning may still be waiting to be understood. Across the plains and wooded landscapes of Japan, enormous earthen mounds rise above the surrounding terrain. Some are partially concealed by vegetation, others surrounded by modern cities, roads, and residential districts. From the ground, many appear simply as unusual hills, but their carefully planned shapes reveal something very different. These are Kofun, monumental tombs constructed primarily between the 3rd and 7th centuries AD, during a formative period of Japanese history. Among the largest are keyhole-shaped mounds known as Zenpo Koen Fun. Their distinctive outline combines a circular rear section with a broad rectangular platform, sometimes surrounded by moats and additional earthworks. Beneath these immense structures, elite burials were placed inside stone chambers that could contain coffins, grave goods, weapons, ornaments, and objects representing the authority of the deceased. Yet, there is a fundamental problem. Many of these chambers cannot simply be entered. Some kofun remain sealed. Others have been damaged, disturbed, or only partially excavated. The largest imperial-associated tombs in Japan are particularly difficult to investigate archaeologically because access is restricted, meaning that the interiors remain known primarily through limited examinations, historical records, comparable tombs, and archaeological evidence from other sites. This creates an unusual situation. The monuments are visible. Their approximate dimensions can be measured. Their external architecture can be studied in extraordinary detail. But in some of the most important examples, the central chamber, the place for which the entire monument was constructed, remains largely inaccessible. What might still be inside? Archaeology has provided a partial answer through kofun that have been excavated. Stone burial chambers can contain finely made objects of iron, bronze, gold, and stone. Researchers have recovered weapons, armor, mirrors, jewelry, horse equipment, and distinctive clay figures known as haniwa. The haniwa are especially revealing. These hollow clay sculptures were placed around certain burial mounds and could depict people, animals, houses, shields, and other objects. They provide rare visual evidence of the society surrounding the elite burials, offering clues about clothing, military equipment, architecture, and ritual practices. But the deeper one looks into the tomb tradition, the more complicated the picture becomes. The earliest kofun emerged during a period of increasing political integration across the Japanese archipelago. The enormous scale of some tombs suggests that powerful leaders could mobilize substantial labor forces. Their construction was not merely a matter of burying an individual, it was a public demonstration of authority. The tomb itself became a political statement. Its size, shape, location, surrounding structures, and burial goods could all communicate social position. A ruler or elite individual could be transformed into a monumental presence that dominated the landscape long after death. The stone chamber served another purpose: separation. Once the burial was completed, the chamber could be sealed and covered by layers of earth. The interior became a restricted space associated with the deceased, protected from ordinary access. But what rituals took place before the final closure? That question is difficult to answer. Archaeological evidence suggests that burial ceremonies could involve offerings, objects of status, weapons, mirrors, ornaments, and perhaps repeated ritual activity. Yet, the final moments of these ceremonies were never recorded in a form that survives clearly today. Some chambers also reveal evidence of disturbance. Tombs were sometimes robbed in antiquity, and later changes to the landscape could damage their contents. In other cases, natural processes have altered the chambers over centuries. This means that even when archaeologists gain access to a Kofun, they may encounter only a partial version of the original burial arrangement. The largest monuments present an even greater problem. The Daisen Kofun in Osaka, traditionally associated with Emperor Nintoku, is among the largest burial mounds in the world by area. Its vast keyhole-shaped form is surrounded by moats and dense vegetation. Yet, its central burial chamber has not been archaeologically excavated. That absence has encouraged speculation. Some have wondered whether such inaccessible tombs could contain artifacts that would significantly change our understanding of early Japanese society. Others have imagined elaborate chambers, additional corridors, or objects that have never been documented. There is no evidence that extraordinary discoveries must be waiting inside. Comparable Kofun provide a much more reliable guide. Their chambers generally reveal sophisticated but understandable burial traditions, reflecting the wealth, technology, religious beliefs, and political structures of their communities. Still, the uncertainty is genuine. Every sealed chamber represents a portion of the archaeological record that cannot currently be examined directly. Even a single, undiscovered burial could potentially provide information about diet, health, ancestry, craftsmanship, trade networks, social hierarchy, or religious practice. And then there is the question of why some tombs were built on such immense scales. Were they intended primarily as monuments to individuals? Were they sacred centers for continuing rituals? Did their construction reinforce alliances between powerful communities? Or did the tombs embody a developing political order in which monumental burial became a way of demonstrating control over both people and landscape? Perhaps the answer was all of these at once. The Kofun world was not simply a collection of graves. It was a monumental expression of a society undergoing profound transformation. The tombs preserve evidence of emerging elites, expanding networks, military organization, long-distance exchange, and changing relationships between the living and the dead. Yet, the central spaces remain strangely distant. A chamber may lie only a few meters below the surface, surrounded by thousands of tons of earth, while the modern world continues around it. Trees grow above the mound. Roads pass nearby. Seasons change. Generations come and go. Inside, the stone architecture remains largely still. For archaeologists, this creates a rare tension between preservation and access. Opening a sealed chamber could reveal valuable evidence, but excavation also permanently changes the context that researchers are trying to understand. In some cases, leaving a tomb undisturbed may preserve information for future methods that do not yet exist. That possibility gives these monuments another dimension. The greatest archaeological discovery may not always be the object waiting inside. Sometimes it is the knowledge preserved by allowing a site to remain intact. And so the great Kofun continue to stand across Japan, their monumental shapes revealing the ambition of societies that lived more than 1,000 years ago, while their deepest chambers remain beyond ordinary reach. We know that people entered some of these spaces. We know that burials took place there. We know that objects of considerable significance were placed beside the dead. But for the tombs that remain sealed, the final arrangement is still unknown. What lies within those untouched chambers may be nothing more than another expression of traditions already familiar from excavated Kofun, or it may contain evidence capable of refining our understanding of an entire period. For now, the earth keeps its boundary. The entrance remains closed, the stone chamber remains in darkness, and the story of the person buried there is still only partially visible from the world outside. In the interior of Oman, where the Al-Hajar Mountains rise above broad gravel plains, the landscape around Bat is marked by clusters of low, beehive-shaped stone structures. Their silhouettes appear stark against the pale terrain. Built from layers of carefully arranged stone, some stand alone, while others gather in dense groups, forming a vast funerary landscape that extends across the surrounding countryside. This is the Bat Archaeological Site, and its remarkable necropolis, part of a broader cultural landscape associated with Oman's early Bronze Age. The tombs date primarily to the 3rd millennium BC, during a period when communities across southeastern Arabia were developing increasingly complex settlements, trading networks, and burial traditions. Bat is especially significant because its monuments survive alongside evidence of settlement, agriculture, metallurgy, and long-distance exchange. At first glance, the tombs appear relatively simple. Most are circular structures with thick stone walls and domed or beehive-like profiles. Their interiors contained burial chambers, and some were built with considerable care and architectural precision. From a distance, however, they resemble countless other stone structures scattered across the Omani landscape. Only when their number and arrangement become apparent does the scale of the cemetery begin to emerge. Why did communities invest so much labor in constructing these monuments for the dead? The answer may lie partly in the society that built them. During the 3rd millennium BC, Oman occupied an important position within regional exchange networks. Archaeological evidence indicates connections with areas of the wider Gulf and Mesopotamia, with copper from Oman believed to have played an important role in long-distance trade. Settlements required organization, specialized production, and access to resources that could be exchanged across considerable distances. The tombs may therefore reflect more than personal mourning. They may have expressed social status, family identity, community membership, or relationships between the living and the dead. Excavations at Bat and related sites have revealed human remains and burial goods, although the contents vary considerably. Some tombs appear to have been used for multiple individuals, while others may have received burials at different times. This raises an important question. Were these monuments intended for particular individuals, or were they collective places where communities maintained connections with their ancestors? The architecture offers no simple answer. Some tombs are relatively isolated. Others occur in clusters, sometimes close to settlements or other monumental structures. Their placement may reflect family relationships, social organization, or the gradual development of a cemetery over generations. The sheer persistence of the tradition is significant. A community could have buried its dead in a simple grave, yet instead it constructed a visible stone monument designed to remain in the landscape. The decision transformed burial into architecture. The dead were not simply placed in the earth. They became associated with permanent structures that could be seen from a distance. Perhaps this helped establish a connection between ancestry and territory. A tomb could mark the presence of a family within a particular landscape. It could communicate continuity between generations. It could also reinforce claims to land, resources, or social standing. But the Bat Necropolis contains another puzzle: its relationship with the wider settlement. Nearby archaeological remains indicate that people lived, worked, farmed, and produced goods in the region. Evidence of copper production is particularly important because Oman was a significant source of copper during the Bronze Age. The existence of substantial funerary monuments within the same cultural landscape suggests that economic activity and ritual life were closely connected. Could the tombs reflect the wealth generated by these networks? Possibly. Monumental construction requires labor, materials, and coordination. A society capable of building hundreds of stone tombs was capable of organizing substantial communal projects. Yet the monuments themselves do not reveal exactly who possessed that authority. Were there hereditary leaders? Were tombs controlled by extended families? Did specialized religious figures oversee funerary ceremonies? Or did communities organize these projects collectively? Archaeologists continue to investigate these questions through the distribution of tombs, settlement patterns, artifacts, and burial remains. More speculative interpretations have occasionally proposed that the beehive tombs possessed astronomical alignments or encoded a sophisticated understanding of the surrounding landscape. Some researchers have explored whether particular orientations or repeated architectural patterns could reflect cosmological beliefs. Such possibilities are difficult to prove. The tombs certainly occupy a landscape in which mountains, horizons, seasonal light, and movement through the desert would have been highly visible. But an apparent alignment does not automatically demonstrate astronomical intention. The strongest evidence remains the funerary function of the monuments and their relationship to the communities that constructed them. Another possibility concerns the movement of ideas. The architecture of the Bat tombs has parallels with other early Bronze Age funerary structures in southeastern Arabia, while the wider archaeological record demonstrates connections across the Gulf. Did communities share architectural traditions through contact and exchange? Or did similar environmental and social conditions produce comparable forms independently? The answer may involve both. Ideas can travel without entire populations migrating. Traders, craftsmen, travelers, and marriage networks can transmit architectural concepts across enormous distances, gradually adapting them to local traditions. And Bat occupied a particularly interesting position within that wider world. It was not an isolated community cut off from distant societies. Its archaeological evidence points toward participation in regional networks that connected the Arabian interior with maritime and overland routes. The tombs therefore stand as more than monuments to the dead. They are also evidence of a society deeply engaged with its environment and with communities beyond its immediate horizon. Yet, the people who built them remain largely anonymous. We do not know the names of the individuals buried inside. We cannot hear the ceremonies that accompanied their deaths. We cannot know precisely what the builders believed would happen after burial, or why certain people received monumental structures while others may have received much simpler graves. The stones preserve the architecture, but not the voices. Today, many of the tombs remain exposed to the intense Omani sun, their carefully placed stones weathering against the desert. Some have survived remarkably well. Others have collapsed or deteriorated. Archaeological investigation has revealed much about their chronology and context, but the deeper social meaning remains more elusive. Perhaps the most compelling feature of the Bat Necropolis is therefore not any single tomb, but the decision repeated across generations to construct them at all. In a landscape shaped by movement, trade, changing climates, and shifting communities, these stone monuments established permanence. They marked places where memory could endure even when individuals and settlements changed. And yet, standing among hundreds of these structures, the original human stories remain frustratingly distant. Were the tombs monuments of status, places of ancestral remembrance, markers of territory, or all of these at once? What rituals took place within their stone chambers, And what did the people of Bat believe they were preserving for those who came after them? The answers remain incomplete. The tombs still stand across the Omani landscape, silent and weathered, preserving a funerary tradition whose physical form has survived far more successfully than its meaning. Somewhere within that silence lies the social world of the people who built them, and the full story of what these stone houses for the dead were meant to represent remains only partly recovered. On the coast of northern Oman, where the mountains descend toward the Gulf of Oman, the landscape around ancient settlements contains some of the most distinctive tombs of the Bronze Age. Built from carefully fitted stone blocks, these structures rise as circular towers above the surrounding ground. Their walls are thick, their interiors divided into burial spaces, and their architecture is strikingly deliberate. They belong to the an-Nar culture, a Bronze Age society that flourished in southeastern Arabia during roughly the 3rd millennium BC. The name comes from an-Nar Island near modern Abu Dhabi, where archaeologists first identified the distinctive cultural tradition. Related tombs and settlements have since been discovered across Oman and the wider Gulf region, revealing a network of communities connected through trade, maritime travel, agriculture, metallurgy, and shared cultural practices. Among the most important sites are the tomb complexes associated with the ancient settlement of an-Nar itself and comparable funerary structures found throughout southeastern Arabia. The tombs are immediately recognizable. Unlike the smaller beehive-shaped monuments of Bat, an-Nar tombs often have substantial circular walls constructed from carefully arranged stones. Some contain multiple burial compartments, and several were reused over extended periods. That detail changes the way we should understand them. These were not necessarily monuments created for one individual at one moment. Some appear to have served as collective burial places, receiving the remains of numerous people over generations. Why would an entire community repeatedly return to the same stone structure to bury its dead? The answer may involve ancestry. A collective tomb could have served as a physical connection between generations. Instead of separating each deceased person into an individual grave, the community could maintain a shared place associated with its ancestors. The tomb became a repository of memory, identity, and perhaps social legitimacy. Archaeological evidence supports the idea of repeated burial. Excavated an-Nar tombs have produced human remains along with pottery, beads, metal objects, stone vessels, and other artifacts. Some tombs contain large quantities of material, suggesting that funerary activity could involve offerings or objects considered appropriate for accompanying the dead. The variety of these artifacts also reveals something else. The an-Nar communities were not isolated. Their pottery and other objects show connections across the Gulf and beyond. Archaeologists have identified evidence of exchange involving Mesopotamia, the Iranian Plateau, and other regions. These networks brought raw materials, finished goods, ideas, and technologies into southeastern Arabia. Copper was particularly important. Oman possesses rich copper resources, and archaeological evidence indicates that communities in the region participated in copper production during the Bronze Age. Metal from southeastern Arabia may have entered long-distance exchange systems connecting the region with powerful societies farther west and north. The tombs therefore belong to a society operating within a much larger economic world. This raises another question. Did access to these trade networks influence social status? The answer may be reflected in the diversity of burial goods. Some individuals may have been buried with more valuable or distinctive objects, while others received fewer offerings. If these differences reflect social hierarchy, the tombs could provide evidence for an increasingly stratified society. Yet, interpreting burial goods is never straightforward. An object placed beside a body does not necessarily represent personal wealth. It may have had religious significance, belonged to a family, or been deposited specifically for the funeral ceremony. A valuable artifact may tell us as much about the community's beliefs as about the status of the individual who received it. The architecture itself may provide another clue. Constructing a large circular tomb required considerable labor. Stones had to be gathered, transported, shaped, and carefully arranged. If a tomb was reused over generations, later communities may also have repaired, modified, or expanded it. The result was a monument that physically accumulated history. Each new burial added another layer to a structure already associated with previous generations. This may explain why the tombs were built so solidly. They were not simply containers for human remains. They were enduring places within the landscape, visible and recognizable to communities that returned to them long after the original builders had died. But the precise rituals surrounding these burials remain difficult to reconstruct. Did mourners gather around the tomb for ceremonies? Were offerings placed inside at particular intervals? Were the dead treated individually before their remains were deposited collectively? Did certain people possess authority over the burial process? Archaeology can identify patterns, but the ceremonies themselves are largely absent. More speculative interpretations have suggested that some an-Nar tombs may have been connected to astronomical orientations or wider cosmological ideas. Others have looked for relationships between the tombs, settlements, mountains, and maritime routes. These possibilities remain uncertain. The strongest evidence points toward funerary and social functions, while the precise symbolic meaning of the circular architecture is still debated. The wider archaeological landscape complicates the picture further. An-Nar communities built settlements containing houses, workshops, storage facilities, and other structures. Their lives were not centered solely on burial. They cultivated crops, managed livestock, worked with metals, and participated in exchange networks that extended far beyond their immediate surroundings. The tombs, therefore, represent only one part of a much larger social system. Perhaps their importance becomes clearer when considered alongside that system. A society engaged in long-distance trade would have needed mechanisms for maintaining identity and social cohesion. Shared burial monuments may have provided precisely such a mechanism. They physically connected communities to their ancestors while reinforcing relationships between families and generations. But this remains an interpretation rather than a complete answer. The people who built the tombs did not leave written explanations of their funerary beliefs. Their understanding of death, ancestry, and the afterlife must be reconstructed from stone, bone, pottery, and patterns of deposition. And even those clues are incomplete. Some tombs have been disturbed by later activity. Others have suffered from erosion, looting, or natural deterioration. What survives today may represent only a fraction of the original archaeological context. Yet, the monuments themselves remain remarkably evocative. Standing beside one of these circular structures, it is possible to see how deliberately it separates the interior from the surrounding world. The thick walls create a boundary between ordinary space and a place associated with the dead. Inside, generations may once have gathered around the remains of their predecessors. Outside, trade routes connected the living world to distant shores. The contrast is striking. These communities were participating in an expanding regional economy, moving goods across seas and deserts, while simultaneously maintaining powerful traditions centered on ancestors and collective burial. Perhaps the tombs were where those two worlds met. They anchored people to a particular place even as trade and travel connected them to distant societies. Today, the an-Nar tombs remain as stone witnesses to that tension between movement and permanence. Their builders lived in a world of exchange, adaptation, and changing social structures, yet they repeatedly returned to these monuments to commemorate the dead. We can reconstruct much of the world around them. We can identify their trade connections, study their metallurgy, examine their pottery, and analyze the human remains recovered from their tombs. But the emotional and religious meaning of the ceremonies remains beyond direct observation. What did a family feel when returning to a tomb used by generations before them? What beliefs justified placing many individuals within the same stone enclosure? And what did the builders hope these monuments would preserve long after their own lives had ended? The answers have not survived in written form. Only the stone remains, carefully arranged into circles that continue to dominate the landscape. And within those walls, the archaeological record still holds fragments of a society whose connections stretched far beyond Arabia, while the deeper meaning of its relationship with the dead remains an open question. Across parts of central Senegal and the Gambia, the landscape changes gradually from open savanna to areas of low vegetation, scattered trees, and sandy soil. Among these surroundings stand groups of carefully positioned stone pillars, usually arranged in circles around a central space. Some stones are tall and slender. Others are shorter, weathered, and irregular. Yet, the arrangement is rarely accidental. These are the Senegambian megalithic circles, a vast collection of stone monuments distributed across hundreds of sites in the region. More than 1,000 individual monuments have been documented, forming one of the largest concentrations of megalithic architecture in West Africa. The scale is difficult to appreciate from a single location. A single circle may appear modest, but viewed as part of the wider archaeological landscape, the monuments reveal a long-lasting tradition that involved repeated construction, burial, and commemoration. Many of the circles are associated with burial sites. Archaeological excavations have uncovered human remains, pottery, beads, metal objects, and other artifacts within or around the monuments. Radiocarbon dating indicates that the tradition developed over a long period, with many monuments dating broadly from the first millennium BC into the early centuries AD, although individual sites vary considerably in age. The people who constructed them therefore belong to communities living in a region undergoing significant environmental and social change. But why build circles of stone around the dead? The most widely supported explanation is funerary. The monuments appear to have marked burial places and may have provided visible locations for remembering ancestors or individuals of social importance. Their construction required labor and organization, suggesting that burial was not simply a private act. The dead became part of the public landscape. A stone circle could mark a person's resting place while also communicating something about the community that built it. Yet, the details remain uncertain. Not every circle is identical. The number of stones varies, their sizes differ, and some monuments include additional structures or arrangements. This variation suggests that the tradition may have changed over time, or that different communities adapted the basic concept according to their own customs. The stones themselves can also be surprisingly distinctive. Some were carefully shaped into narrow pillars, while others retain more natural forms. At certain sites, one stone may stand taller than the others, perhaps reflecting a deliberate hierarchy within the arrangement. Was this symbolic? Could the tallest stones have represented particular individuals, families, or social roles? Or did practical considerations determine their placement? Without written records, archaeologists must examine the physical relationships between stones, burials, artifacts, and surrounding settlements. The broader landscape offers additional clues. The monuments are often associated with ancient settlements and agricultural regions. Their distribution suggests that the communities responsible for them were not isolated groups moving randomly across the landscape. They lived within organized territories and maintained traditions that could continue for generations. That continuity is perhaps the most remarkable feature. Constructing a stone circle requires effort, but maintaining a tradition over centuries requires something more enduring: shared cultural meaning. A community must continue to recognize the importance of the monument, Children must learn its significance. Rituals must be repeated, and each generation must decide that the stones remain worth preserving. This suggests that the circles may have played a role in collective identity as much as individual burial. They could have marked ancestral territories, reinforced relationships between families, or established visible connections between living communities and their predecessors. The possibility of social hierarchy is also worth considering. Some burials contain more elaborate objects than others. Differences in grave goods may reflect distinctions in status, occupation, gender, or age. If so, the monuments could preserve evidence of a society in which social roles were already differentiated. Yet, archaeologists remain cautious. Objects placed in graves do not automatically represent wealth. They may have carried symbolic meanings that had little relationship to economic status. A bead, tool, or metal object could have been chosen for reasons connected with identity or ritual rather than material value. The circles themselves may provide another form of evidence. Their repeated geometric arrangement suggests that communities possessed established rules governing monument construction. Even if the stones appear simple, their placement reflects planning. The builders had to select a location, determine the dimensions of the circle, transport stones, and establish their positions with sufficient consistency for the structure to retain its intended form. That level of organization tells us something about the societies behind the monuments. They could coordinate communal labor around shared cultural objectives. More speculative interpretations have occasionally proposed astronomical purposes for the circles. Some have suggested that particular stones may have been aligned with celestial events, seasonal changes, or solar positions. The possibility is intriguing, especially because prehistoric communities throughout the world observed the movements of the sky. But there is currently no reason to assume that astronomy was the primary purpose of the Senegambian monuments. Their strongest archaeological associations remain funerary. The tendency to interpret every circular monument as an astronomical observatory can also obscure more immediate explanations. A circle may have been important because of the people buried there rather than because of the stars above it. Still, the relationship between burial and landscape raises deeper questions. Why were particular places chosen? Were certain areas already regarded as sacred before the monuments were constructed? Did rivers, fertile land, elevated ground, or existing settlements influence the placement? And did later generations continue using the same sites because they were believed to possess ancestral significance? These questions become especially important because the monuments were not constructed simultaneously. They represent generations of activity. A circle built centuries after another may reflect a tradition inherited from earlier communities, but it could also represent a transformation of that tradition. Meanings change, rituals evolve, and monuments can acquire new significance as societies themselves change. The archaeological record therefore captures not a single culture, but a long sequence of human decisions. Today, many of the stones remain standing beneath the West African sun. Their surfaces are weathered, their original ceremonies have disappeared, and the communities that created them have long since changed. Yet, the circles still define particular places within the landscape. They tell us that the dead mattered enough to be marked permanently. They tell us that communities possess the organizational ability to move and arrange heavy stones. And they suggest that memory, ancestry, and territory were closely connected. But the monuments do not tell us how the people who built them understood death. Did they believe ancestors continued to influence the living? Were the circles places of ritual gatherings? Did families return to them during particular ceremonies? Were the stones intended to preserve individual identities, or did they represent entire communities? The evidence can support several possibilities without providing a final answer. More speculative ideas may continue to emerge as researchers study the monuments with new technologies, compare their arrangements, and examine the biological remains of the people buried there. For now, the Senegambian circles remain remarkably quiet witnesses to a long and complex tradition. The stones have survived. The graves have survived in fragments. But the voices that once explained why those circles mattered have not. And somewhere within the repeated geometry of the monuments, the burial deposits, and the surrounding landscape lies a social and spiritual world that archaeology has only begun to reconstruct. What did these circles truly mean to the people who gathered their stones? And how much of that meaning still lies beyond the evidence we can recover? Under the intense sun of southern Peru, the desert surrounding the Nazca region stretches toward distant mountains in shades of ochre, gray, and brown. Rain is exceptionally scarce, vegetation is limited, and the landscape can preserve traces of human activity for remarkably long periods. Among these barren plains lies the Chauchilla Necropolis. Scattered across the desert are dozens of ancient burial pits, many containing human remains that still retain fragments of hair, skin, and textiles. Some bodies appear seated, with knees drawn toward the chest and arms positioned close to the torso. Others remain wrapped in layers of cloth or surrounded by pottery and personal objects. The sight is unsettling, but it is also archaeologically extraordinary. Chauchilla is associated primarily with the later phases of the Nazca cultural tradition and subsequent communities that used the cemetery. Most of the visible burials date broadly from the first millennium AD, with some evidence extending into later periods. The cemetery therefore represents not a single moment, but generations of funerary activity in one carefully selected desert landscape. Why was this place chosen? The environment itself may provide part of the answer. The extreme dryness of the Nazca Desert creates conditions that can naturally slow decomposition. When bodies were placed in protected tombs and wrapped in textiles, the arid climate could preserve organic material far longer than would be possible in wetter environments. This does not mean the people who created the cemetery understood preservation in modern scientific terms, but they clearly possessed detailed funerary traditions. The bodies were carefully positioned, wrapped, and placed within prepared graves. Pottery vessels were frequently deposited nearby, sometimes decorated with human, animal, or geometric imagery. Other objects may have accompanied the deceased as offerings or possessions. The arrangement suggests that burial was not simply disposal, it was a deliberate process. The body was treated in a particular way, the tomb was prepared, objects were selected, and the burial was integrated into a wider system of beliefs concerning death and remembrance. One of the most striking features is the posture of many of the remains. The seated position, with the limbs drawn inward, has often been interpreted as a deliberate funerary posture. Some researchers have suggested that it may have symbolized rebirth, fetal positioning, or preparation for another stage of existence. Such interpretations are plausible, but they remain interpretations. The people who performed these ceremonies left no written explanation telling us what the posture represented. It could have had religious meaning. It could have reflected practical considerations related to wrapping and transporting the body. Or it may have carried several meanings simultaneously. The pottery provides another window into their world. Some vessels depict human faces with carefully modeled features. Others show animals, plants, or abstract designs. Such objects demonstrate that the communities associated with the cemetery possessed a rich visual tradition. But were the vessels' offerings specifically made for the dead? Were they used during funeral ceremonies and later placed inside the tomb? Or were they ordinary objects repurposed for burial? Again, the evidence does not always provide a definitive answer. The cemetery also reveals something about the changing history of the region. Chauchilla was used over extended periods, and later groups appear to have interacted with earlier burial spaces. Some graves were disturbed, and objects or remains were displaced. This complicates archaeological interpretation, because the cemetery we see today may not perfectly reflect its original arrangement. Modern disturbance has added another layer. The site suffered from looting before systematic archaeological protection became established. Tomb robbers opened graves in search of pottery and other valuable objects, leaving human remains exposed and archaeological context damaged. What survives is therefore only part of the original record. Yet, even this incomplete evidence is extraordinary. The preservation of textiles is especially valuable. In many archaeological environments, organic materials disappear quickly, leaving only stone and pottery. At Chauchilla, fragments of woven cloth provide direct evidence of craftsmanship, clothing, burial practices, and the materials available to ancient communities. The preserved hair and other organic remains can also reveal information about diet, health, ancestry, and patterns of life. In this sense, the cemetery is more than a collection of burials. It is a biological archive. Each body potentially carries information about an individual who lived in the region centuries ago. Teeth can reveal aspects of diet and childhood movement. Bones can show evidence of disease, injury, or physical activity. Textile fibers can reveal technological traditions. The dead, therefore, continue to communicate, even without written words. But the emotional meaning of the cemetery remains harder to recover. What did families experience when they placed a loved one inside one of these tombs? Did they return to the burial place during ceremonies? Did the dead remain active members of the community through ritual remembrance? Some evidence from Andean societies suggests that relationships between the living and the dead could remain important long after burial. Ancestors could be remembered, honored, and incorporated into social traditions. This raises the possibility that the carefully wrapped bodies of Chauchilla were not simply intended to disappear from the world. Perhaps they were meant to remain connected to it. More speculative interpretations have sometimes portrayed the cemetery as evidence of elaborate practices involving deliberate mummification or highly developed knowledge of preservation. The evidence does show careful preparation of bodies and remarkable natural preservation, but it is important not to confuse environmental conditions with intentional preservation techniques. The desert itself played an enormous role. Dry air, limited rainfall, and stable conditions helped protect remains that would have decomposed rapidly elsewhere. That natural process may be one of the most fascinating aspects of the site. The people of Chauchilla created funerary practices suited to their environment, and the environment in turn preserved those practices for centuries. The cemetery therefore represents a relationship between human intention and natural forces. People selected the burial location. They prepared the bodies. They constructed the graves. They placed objects beside the dead. Then the desert took over. Generation after generation, the landscape remained dry while the surrounding world changed. Settlements rose and declined, political systems shifted, and new traditions developed, yet the graves remained beneath the surface. Today, many of those burials are exposed for archaeological study, revealing faces and bodies that survived when almost everything else around them disappeared. Yet, preservation does not equal understanding. We can see how the dead were positioned. We can examine what was placed beside them. We can study the textiles, pottery, bones, and biological remains. But we cannot directly hear the beliefs that made these practices meaningful. Were the bodies prepared for an afterlife? Were they intended to remain connected with their descendants? Did the cemetery represent a sacred landscape shared by generations? Or did each family understand these graves in its own way? The answers remain incomplete. Chauchilla has preserved the physical traces of death with remarkable clarity, while leaving the spiritual meaning of those burials far more difficult to recover. Under the relentless Peruvian sun, the cemetery continues to hold its silence. The bodies remain seated within their ancient graves, wrapped in the remnants of a vanished age, surrounded by objects carefully chosen by people whose voices have long disappeared. The desert has preserved their remains, but what exactly were their descendants hoping would remain with them after death? On the broad steppe near the southern Ural Mountains, the landscape appears almost endless. Low hills rise above open grassland, and the horizon stretches uninterrupted beneath an enormous sky. Yet, within this seemingly quiet terrain lie the remains of a highly organized Bronze Age settlement and surrounding burial landscape. This is the archaeological complex of Arkaim, associated with the Sintashta cultural tradition and generally dated to the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium BC. Arkaim itself is best known as a fortified settlement, but the surrounding region contains numerous burial and ceremonial structures that help reveal the society behind it. Together, they form part of what archaeologists sometimes call the country of towns, a concentration of related settlements and monuments distributed across the southern Ural steppe. At the center of Arkaim, archaeologists uncovered a carefully planned settlement. 2 massive circular defensive walls enclosed the town, with houses arranged in an organized pattern around the interior. Entrances controlled movement into the settlement, while drainage channels and other structural features indicate that the inhabitants had developed sophisticated methods for managing water and living within a dense community. But the burial complexes surrounding this world are equally significant. Nearby cemeteries contain graves associated with the Sintashta population. Some burials include pottery, ornaments, weapons, and other objects, while others contain human remains arranged according to particular funerary traditions. The graves provide a different perspective from the settlement. Inside the fortified town, we see planning, defense, craftsmanship, and daily life. Within the burial grounds, we see how these communities treated the dead. And together, the 2 records raise a difficult question. What kind of society needed such elaborate settlements, defenses, and funerary structures in the first place? The Sintashta communities appear to have lived in a world where warfare, metallurgy, animal husbandry, and long-distance interaction were increasingly important. Archaeological evidence indicates substantial expertise in copper and bronze production. Some settlements contain furnaces and evidence of metalworking, suggesting that specialized craft production played an important role. The burial evidence adds another remarkable detail. Several graves contain objects associated with horses and chariots. The Sintashta culture is particularly important in archaeological research concerning some of the earliest known light-spoked wheeled chariots, with evidence dating to around the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC. This discovery has transformed interpretations of the region. The chariot was not merely a vehicle. In the open steppe, it could provide mobility, prestige, and military advantage. Its presence in elite burials suggests that horses and wheeled transport may have been closely connected with social status and warfare. But were these people primarily warriors? That picture may be too simple. Their communities also required farmers, herders, metalworkers, builders, traders, and ritual specialists. A fortified settlement could protect valuable resources, but it could also reflect competition between neighboring groups or a broader transformation in social organization. The burial complexes provide clues about inequality. Some graves contain more elaborate goods than others. Certain individuals were buried with objects that required considerable labor and specialized production. Such differences may indicate distinctions in status, occupation, gender, or social role. Yet, burial wealth does not always translate directly into political power. Objects may have carried religious or symbolic importance, rather than serving as measures of wealth. A weapon could represent a social identity rather than actual military activity. A horse-related object could have had ritual significance. This is where interpretation becomes difficult. Archaeologists possess the physical remains, but the meanings assigned to those objects by the people who buried them are largely absent. The architecture of Arkaim has also encouraged speculation. Its circular design, concentric walls, controlled entrances, and organized internal layout have led some observers to describe it as an exceptionally sophisticated prehistoric city. Others have emphasized possible astronomical relationships between the settlement's geometry and celestial events. There is evidence that the inhabitants observed their environment carefully, as any society dependent upon seasonal cycles would have done. But claims that Arkaim was deliberately constructed as a precise astronomical observatory remain debated. The strongest evidence concerns its defensive and residential functions. More fringe interpretations have gone considerably further, portraying Arkaim as the center of an advanced prehistoric civilization, or connecting it with later religious traditions and legendary peoples of Eurasia. These ideas are culturally interesting, but archaeological evidence does not require them. Arkaim can be extraordinary without becoming something beyond archaeology. Its importance lies precisely in what the excavated remains demonstrate. Communities living more than 4,000 years ago could organize complex settlements, produce advanced metalwork, manage livestock, construct defensive systems, and develop elaborate funerary traditions. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is not that the people were inexplicably advanced. It is how recognizable their concerns can appear. They built walls for protection. They created specialized tools and weapons. They organized communities. They buried their dead with objects representing identity and status. They developed technologies that could transform movement across the steppe. And they constructed places intended to endure. Yet Arkaim was not permanent. The settlement was eventually abandoned, and its inhabitants moved away, leaving behind the foundations of houses, defensive walls, burial grounds, and traces of a society that had flourished for only a limited period. Why was it abandoned? Environmental change may have played a role. Shifts in resources, changing settlement patterns, social pressures, or transformations in regional networks are all possibilities. There is no single explanation that accounts for every Sintashta settlement. The surrounding cemeteries complicate the story further. Burials represent moments of deliberate closure. A person died, objects were selected, a grave was prepared, and the body was placed within the earth. Yet, the objects accompanying the dead reveal that identity continued to matter after death. A warrior might be associated with weapons. An individual connected with horses might receive equestrian equipment. Others may have been buried with ornaments or pottery. These choices created a material portrait of the deceased. But did the burial reflect who the person actually was, or who the community wanted them to be remembered as? That distinction is almost impossible to recover. The graves can tell us what was placed there. They cannot tell us what was spoken. They cannot reproduce the ceremonies, the mourning, the beliefs, or the stories surrounding each burial. And this is perhaps where Arkaim becomes most compelling. The settlement's geometry can be mapped. Its walls can be measured. Its metallurgy can be analyzed. The graves can be excavated and their contents cataloged. Yet the society itself remains partly inaccessible. We see the physical framework they created, but not the thoughts that animated it. Today, the remains of Arkaim occupy a landscape that looks deceptively quiet. Grass grows over parts of the ancient settlement, while the surrounding steppe continues toward the distant Ural horizon. Beneath that landscape are the traces of houses, workshops, defensive structures, graves, and ceremonies belonging to communities that lived during a formative period of Eurasian prehistory. Their world was not simple. It was organized, competitive, technologically capable, and deeply concerned with the relationship between the living, the dead, animals, and the surrounding landscape. And yet, the ultimate reasons behind some of their customs remain uncertain. Why were particular people buried with particular objects? What role did the chariot play in their social and ritual world? Why did these communities construct settlements with such formidable defenses, only to abandon them generations later? The archaeological evidence continues to answer some of these questions while leaving others open. Arkaim gives us walls, graves, weapons, horses, and fragments of human lives. What it does not give us is a complete account of the people who created them. And somewhere between the fortified settlement and the silent burial grounds lies a story that archaeology has reconstructed only in fragments, a story whose remaining pieces may still change how we understand one of the earliest complex societies of the Eurasian steppe. In the highlands of South Sulawesi, Indonesia, steep green valleys rise around the traditional homeland of the Toraja people. Rice terraces descend along hillsides, limestone cliffs break through the vegetation, and beneath the tropical sky stand enormous carved stones that appear almost out of place among the surrounding fields. Some are rough monoliths. Others are carefully shaped and raised upright. Many are associated with burial grounds, ceremonial spaces, or locations where communities have maintained relationships with their ancestors for generations. These are the Toraja Megaliths, part of a wider cultural landscape in which stone, death, ancestry, and social identity are deeply connected. Unlike many prehistoric monuments discussed elsewhere, the Toraja tradition cannot be understood simply as the remains of a vanished society. Toraja communities continue to exist, and many funerary traditions remain culturally important today, although practices have changed over time and vary between communities. This continuity makes the monuments particularly valuable. Here, archaeology is not working entirely in silence. Living traditions, oral histories, ethnographic observations, and archaeological evidence can sometimes illuminate one another. Yet, even with this unusual advantage, important questions remain. Why did monumental stone construction become so closely associated with the dead? In Toraja culture, funerary ceremonies can be elaborate communal events involving extended families, ritual exchanges, animals, music, and carefully structured periods of mourning. The deceased may remain closely connected to the household for a considerable period before burial, depending on cultural and family circumstances. The physical treatment of the dead is therefore part of a much larger social process. Death does not necessarily represent an immediate separation. Instead, the deceased can remain part of the family's social world until the appropriate ceremonies have taken place. The landscape reflects this continuing relationship. Some Toraja burial sites are carved directly into limestone cliffs. Small chambers hold human remains, while carved wooden figures known as tau may stand outside certain burial areas, representing the deceased and watching over the surrounding landscape. Elsewhere, large stones have been erected as monuments associated with important funerary events. These stones are sometimes called simbuang. They can be substantial, requiring coordinated labor to transport and raise them. Their construction may be associated with major ceremonies and the social standing of the deceased. The monument therefore communicates something beyond grief. It can express status, family identity, obligation, and the continuing importance of ancestral relationships. But this creates a fascinating archaeological problem. When does a stone become a monument to a person, and when does it become a monument to an entire community? A large ceremonial stone requires collective effort. Families may organize labor, resources, and ritual obligations over extended periods. The resulting monument becomes evidence of social cooperation. It also makes inequality visible. Not every individual receives the same funerary treatment. The scale and complexity of ceremonies can vary according to family circumstances, social position, and local traditions. The stone, therefore, becomes part of a social language. Its size, placement, and association with a particular funeral can communicate the standing of the deceased and the resources available to their family. This is not unique to Toraja culture. Across many societies, monumental burial architecture has served as a way of expressing status and maintaining ancestral memory. What makes the Toraja landscape especially compelling is that some of these relationships remain visible within living cultural practice. The dead are not simply archaeological specimens. They remain connected to descendants through ceremonies, family obligations, and sacred places. This continuity also helps explain why some Toraja funerary traditions can appear unfamiliar to outside observers. The preservation of the body, the timing of burial, the gathering of relatives, and the treatment of the burial place all belong to a cultural system in which death has social dimensions extending far beyond the moment of physical death. From an archaeological perspective, this provides a rare opportunity. Researchers can observe how communities understand funerary monuments and compare those practices with older megalithic remains. But caution is essential. Modern traditions should not automatically be projected backward thousands of years. Cultural practices change, and the origins of Toraja megalithic traditions are not fully documented. Similarities between present-day customs and archaeological monuments can provide clues, but they cannot prove that every ancient practice remained unchanged. More speculative interpretations have occasionally suggested that some Toraja megaliths represent a continuous tradition stretching far deeper into prehistory than current evidence can demonstrate. Others have proposed that the stone monuments were connected to astronomical observations, fertility rituals, or supernatural forces associated with the surrounding mountains. Such interpretations are difficult to verify. The strongest evidence points toward funerary and ancestral functions, while the precise symbolic meaning of individual monuments may vary between communities and periods. The landscape itself may be just as important as the stones. Toraja settlements exist within dramatic terrain dominated by mountains, cliffs, valleys, and cultivated terraces. Burial sites are often integrated into this environment rather than separated from it. The dead remain physically present within the landscape of the living. A cliff containing ancestral graves can overlook fields cultivated by descendants. A stone monument can stand near the location of a major ceremony. A carved figure can face outward toward the valley. This arrangement suggests that memory was not confined to an enclosed cemetery. It was distributed across the landscape. That may be one reason the Toraja megaliths feel so different from many prehistoric burial monuments. They are not simply relics of a society that disappeared. They form part of a cultural geography in which ancestry remains visible. Yet, the older archaeological record still contains unanswered questions. When exactly did the earliest Toraja megalithic traditions begin? How did monumental stone practices develop? Were they influenced by contacts with neighboring communities, or did they emerge largely from local traditions? And how did the meaning of these monuments change as Toraja societies encountered new political, religious, and economic influences? Archaeology has provided fragments of an answer, but the chronology remains complex. Some traditions appear relatively recent compared with the great prehistoric monuments of Eurasia and the Near East. Others may preserve practices with deeper roots. Distinguishing between continuity and later cultural development is one of the central challenges. There is also the question of memory itself. A monument can preserve a name. It can preserve a location. It can preserve the social status of a family. But can it preserve the beliefs surrounding death? Only partially. The stone survives because stone is durable. The ceremony survives only as long as people continue performing it. The words spoken during a funeral may disappear within generations, while the monument remains unchanged. This creates a striking imbalance between physical evidence and human meaning. Today, Toraja landscapes contain both living traditions and archaeological traces. Stone monuments stand among cultivated hills, burial chambers remain carved into cliffs, and ancestral figures continue to occupy carefully chosen places. The relationship between past and present is therefore unusually visible. But even here, where cultural memory has survived more strongly than at many archaeological sites, the deepest origins remain uncertain. The stones tell us that ancestors were important enough to receive monumental recognition. They show that funerary ceremonies could mobilize entire communities. They reveal how death, social status, and landscape became intertwined. Yet, they do not provide a complete explanation of how these traditions first emerged. And perhaps that is the enduring question surrounding the Toraja Megaliths. How far back does the relationship between stone and ancestry truly reach? And how much of the original meaning has been transformed by the centuries of cultural change that followed? The monuments remain in the hills, surrounded by a landscape where the living still remember the dead. Their presence suggests continuity, but continuity does not necessarily mean that every ancient meaning has survived. Somewhere between the archaeological stones and the living traditions lies a history that remains only partly visible, and the deeper origins of that relationship may still be waiting to be understood. High in the northern Ethiopian highlands, surrounded by dry valleys, rugged mountains, and fields shaped by centuries of cultivation, the ruins of Yeha stand in quiet isolation. Massive stone walls rise from the earth, their surfaces weathered by time and exposure. Nearby, fragments of inscriptions, architectural remains, and ancient structures reveal that this was once an important center of political and religious activity. Yeha is generally regarded as one of the earliest major urban and monumental sites in the northern Horn of Africa. Its history reaches back more than 2,000 years, with evidence of occupation and monumental construction extending into the first millennium BC. The site is closely associated with the cultural traditions that preceded and contributed to the development of the later Kingdom of Aksum. But Yeha is not simply an abandoned settlement. It is a place where several cultural influences appear to converge. The most prominent surviving structure is the so-called Great Temple, a monumental building constructed from enormous stone blocks. Its walls display a level of craftsmanship that immediately raises questions about the society capable of producing them. The blocks were carefully cut and fitted. Some are remarkably large. The surviving masonry demonstrates sophisticated knowledge of stone construction, while the overall scale indicates that substantial labor and organization were available to the builders. What purpose required such a monument? Archaeological evidence suggests that the structure had a religious function and was associated with a major deity worshipped in the region during the pre-Aksumite period. Later, modifications and reuse complicate the archaeological picture, but the monument clearly occupied an important place within the ritual landscape. The architecture also provides clues about connections beyond Ethiopia. Elements of Yeha's material culture and inscriptions show strong relationships with southern Arabia, particularly the Sabaean cultural sphere. This does not mean that Yeha was simply a colony established by outsiders. The evidence points toward sustained interaction, exchange, and cultural adaptation between communities on opposite sides of the Red Sea. The Red Sea was not necessarily a barrier. It was a route. People, goods, technologies, religious ideas, and writing traditions could move across it. This changes the way Yeha should be understood. Rather than viewing the northern Ethiopian highlands as an isolated region, archaeologists increasingly see them as part of a wider network linking Africa and Arabia during the first millennium BC. Inscriptions are among the most important evidence. Several inscriptions found at Yeha use South Arabian scripts, providing direct evidence of literacy and cultural contact. They reveal names, religious associations, and aspects of political life, although the surviving texts are limited and do not provide a complete historical narrative. Their presence raises another question. Who controlled Yeha? Was it governed by local rulers who adopted writing and architectural styles through contact with Arabia? Did migrant communities play a significant role? Or did local societies independently develop political institutions while selectively incorporating foreign influences? The evidence does not permit a simple answer. The strongest interpretation is one of interaction rather than complete replacement. Local traditions and external influences appear to have met and developed together, producing a distinctive cultural environment. This makes Yeha especially important for understanding the origins of complex societies in the Horn of Africa. The later kingdom of Assam became one of the most significant powers of the ancient Red Sea world, controlling territory and participating in international trade networks that connected Africa, Arabia, and beyond. Yeha predates the height of Assam. Its monuments therefore provide a glimpse into an earlier stage of development. How did a society capable of constructing monumental stone architecture emerge in this highland environment? Agriculture likely played an important role. The surrounding highlands offered productive areas for cultivation, while access to regional trade routes provided opportunities for exchange. Political authority could develop where agricultural surplus, specialized crafts, and trade networks came together. But monumental architecture requires more than resources. It requires organization. Someone had to coordinate workers, acquire stone, plan construction, and maintain the social system necessary to support such an undertaking. The Great Temple therefore represents a political statement as much as a religious one. Its scale would have demonstrated the ability of the community to mobilize labor and resources around a shared institution. The stone itself may have communicated permanence. A temporary structure could serve a ritual purpose, but a massive stone monument could project authority across generations. And yet the society that built it left behind relatively few surviving records. This is one of Yeha's enduring difficulties. Archaeologists can reconstruct architecture, examine artifacts, analyze inscriptions, and compare the site with other settlements across the Red Sea region. But the voices of ordinary inhabitants remain largely absent. What did daily life look like? How were agricultural communities organized? Who controlled trade? How were religious ceremonies conducted? And what relationship existed between political leaders and religious institutions? Only fragments survive. Later history adds another layer of complexity. The site was reused by Christian communities, and the ruins contain evidence of later religious activity. A monastery associated with the Church of Ethiopia stands near the ancient remains, creating a remarkable physical overlap between different periods of religious history. The landscape, therefore, contains multiple chronological layers. A pre-Christian sanctuary, later Christian structures, ancient inscriptions, modern communities. Each period altered the meaning of the place without completely erasing what came before. This continuity can sometimes create confusion. Later traditions may preserve memories of earlier locations, but they do not necessarily preserve the original beliefs or purposes associated with them. More speculative interpretations of Yeha have occasionally attempted to connect its monuments with legendary kingdoms, biblical narratives, or accounts of distant civilizations. Such connections can be culturally fascinating, but archaeological evidence must be separated from later traditions and historical speculation. The documented evidence is already remarkable. Yeha demonstrates that communities in the northern Horn of Africa participated in long-distance cultural networks more than 2,000 years ago. They used writing, constructed monumental architecture, developed organized religious institutions, and interacted with societies across the Red Sea. No extraordinary explanation is required. Yet, the site remains enigmatic because so much of its story is incomplete. The massive stones reveal the sophistication of the builders, but not their names. The inscriptions reveal fragments of language and belief, but not an entire political history. The ruins reveal a powerful center, but not precisely how that power was organized. And the surrounding landscape offers clues without providing a complete narrative. Perhaps this is what makes Yeha so compelling. It stands at the intersection of several histories: the history of the Horn of Africa, the history of the Red Sea, the development of writing and state institutions, and the movement of ideas between Africa and Arabia. Its stones demonstrate connection rather than isolation, but they also preserve a silence. Who first conceived these monumental structures? How did local traditions and foreign influences combine to produce them? And what happened within the walls when the temple was active, before later generations transformed the site? The answers remain incomplete. Today, the great stones of Yeha continue to rise above the Ethiopian highlands, surrounded by a landscape that has witnessed centuries of cultural change. The ruins are tangible evidence of a society that possessed ambition, organization, craftsmanship, and connections extending across the Red Sea. Yet the deeper story remains partly beyond reach. The inscriptions speak in fragments. The stones preserve their geometry. The landscape preserves the setting. And somewhere between them lies the history of the people who transformed this remote highland site into one of the earliest monumental centers of the region, a history that archaeology continues to recover, one fragment at a time. Near the Zarafshan River in western Tajikistan, where the foothills of Central Asia rise toward the Great Mountain Ranges, the archaeological remains of Sarazm lie beneath a landscape of dry valleys, cultivated fields, and distant peaks. At first, the site appears modest. Low earthen walls and excavated foundations barely rise above the ground. Yet, beneath these quiet remains lies one of the oldest known proto-urban settlements of Central Asia. Sarazm was occupied from roughly the 4th millennium BC, with its earliest phases dating to around the late 4th millennium BC. Its importance comes not from monumental walls or enormous temples, but from what its artifacts reveal about the connections maintained by its inhabitants. Here, archaeologists have found evidence of agriculture, craft production, metallurgy, long-distance exchange, and cultural interaction extending across remarkably large areas. The settlement, therefore, presents a puzzle of a different kind. How did a community in this mountain edge environment become connected to regions hundreds, perhaps thousands, of kilometers away? Sarazm emerged during a period when settled communities were becoming increasingly established across parts of Central Asia. People cultivated crops, raised animals, produced ceramics, worked stone, and gradually developed increasingly specialized crafts. At Sarazm, evidence of copper metallurgy is particularly significant. Copper objects and traces of metalworking indicate that inhabitants possessed knowledge of extracting and shaping metal at a surprisingly early stage. This does not mean they were operating an industrial center in the modern sense. Rather, it suggests specialized production within a community already participating in wider systems of exchange. The artifacts tell an even broader story. Archaeologists have recovered materials whose origins appear to lie far beyond the immediate region. Stones, shells, metals, and other objects indicate contact with territories extending toward the Iranian Plateau, the Indus region, and other parts of Central Asia. Some objects could have moved through several intermediary communities. A shell from a distant coast did not necessarily arrive through one direct journey. It may have passed from trader to trader, settlement to settlement, eventually reaching Sarazm. But even indirect exchange requires networks. Someone had to travel. Someone had to recognize the value of a material. Someone had to establish relationships that allowed goods to move between communities. This makes Sarazm important for understanding the early development of long-distance interaction across Eurasia. The settlement was not yet a great city in the later historical sense. But its scale, organization, and craft specialization suggest a community more complex than a small agricultural village. Large houses and organized activity areas have been identified. Evidence of storage and food production indicates that residents had developed systems for managing agricultural resources. Work areas reveal specialized crafts, and the variety of imported materials suggests that some inhabitants participated in exchange networks extending well beyond the local environment. Perhaps the most revealing feature is the combination. Agriculture supported permanent settlement. Permanent settlement encouraged specialization. Specialization created goods that could be exchanged. Exchange brought unfamiliar materials and ideas into the community. And those connections may have strengthened Sarazm's importance within the wider region. This process would eventually contribute to the development of larger urban centers across Central Asia. But Sarazm existed thousands of years before many of the civilizations most commonly associated with the region. Its inhabitants lived at a time when the boundaries between settled farmers, herders, craftsmen, and traders were still developing. The settlement therefore offers a glimpse into a formative period when social complexity was emerging gradually rather than appearing suddenly. The burial evidence adds another dimension. Archaeologists have found graves containing human remains and associated objects. Some burials include ornaments and other possessions, while the variation between graves suggests that individuals may have occupied different social positions. Yet, interpreting such differences is difficult. A richly furnished burial may represent wealth, but it could also reflect ritual status, family identity, occupation, or a particular ceremony. The objects do not explain themselves. They must be interpreted through their context. This is where Sarazm becomes especially fascinating. The settlement contains evidence of local life and distant contact, but the precise social mechanisms behind those connections remain uncertain. Who organized trade? Were there specialist merchants? Did traveling craftsmen move between settlements? Were goods exchanged through seasonal gatherings? Or did kinship and marriage networks carry objects and ideas across enormous distances? Several possibilities are plausible. None can yet explain the entire picture. The site's location may provide part of the answer. Sarazm occupied a strategic position near the Zarafshan River, close to routes leading between the highlands and broader Central Asian plains. Rivers could support agriculture, while valleys and passes offered pathways through difficult terrain. Its geography therefore placed Sarazm at an important crossroads. But geography alone does not create a trading center. Communities must recognize opportunities, establish relationships, and develop enough stability to sustain exchange. The archaeological record suggests that Sarazm achieved some of this stability. Yet, the settlement's story did not continue indefinitely. After many centuries of occupation, Sarazm declined and was eventually abandoned. The reasons remain debated. Changes in climate, river patterns, economic networks, or regional settlement systems may have contributed. Perhaps several factors combined. The environment around Sarazm was never static. A river can change its course. Agricultural conditions can deteriorate. Trade routes can shift. Neighboring communities can rise or decline. A settlement dependent upon particular combinations of resources and connections may become less important when those conditions change. This possibility makes the abandonment of Sarazm less mysterious in a supernatural sense, but no less compelling historically. The site demonstrates how vulnerable early complex communities could be to changing circumstances. More speculative interpretations have sometimes portrayed Sarazm as an extraordinarily advanced center that somehow anticipated later urban civilizations. Such claims go beyond the evidence. Sarazm was remarkable, but its achievements can be understood within the broader development of prehistoric Central Asian societies. Its significance lies not in unexplained technology, but in the sophistication of its social connections. People living there cultivated crops. They raised animals. They worked metals. They produced ceramics. They constructed substantial buildings, and they obtained materials from regions far beyond their immediate surroundings. That combination is enough to challenge the old image of prehistoric communities as isolated and self-contained. Sarazm reveals a different reality. Even thousands of years ago, people moved through landscapes, exchanged materials, learned techniques from distant communities, and participated in networks whose full extent is still being reconstructed. A single shell or metal object could represent a chain of human interactions stretching across mountains and deserts. Yet, we rarely know the individuals who carried those objects. Their names are absent. Their languages are largely unknown. Their personal journeys have disappeared. Only the material traces remain. Today, the excavated remains of Sarazm sit quietly beneath the Central Asian sky. The mountains that once framed the lives of its inhabitants remain on the horizon, while the river continues to shape the landscape. The settlement itself has become a window into a world that existed long before written history provided detailed accounts of Central Asia. And still, important questions remain. How extensive were Sarazm's trade networks? How did its inhabitants organize authority? Why did certain crafts become specialized? What caused the settlement's eventual decline? And how much of its history remains concealed beneath areas that have never been excavated? Perhaps future archaeological work will provide new answers. Perhaps the most important discoveries will not come from spectacular objects, but from small fragments, a piece of pottery, a mineral trace, a burial, or the remains of an ancient building. For now, Sarazm remains a remarkable archaeological crossroads, where local agriculture and distant exchange met thousands of years before the emergence of the great empires of later Central Asia. Its ruins are modest compared with the monumental cities that followed, but the network they reveal may have been anything but modest. Somewhere within those weathered foundations lies the record of people who learned to connect a mountain settlement with a much wider world, and the full extent of those connections is still being uncovered. From the prehistoric settlements along the Zayandeh route, where communities adapted to water, agriculture, and long-distance exchange, our journey now moves far west, toward the quiet countryside of France. Here, beneath grassy mounds and centuries of weathered earth, an extraordinary Neolithic complex preserves another attempt to give permanence to memory and the dead. In western France, near the village of Bougon, several enormous earthen mounds rise gently from the surrounding fields. Covered in grass and softened by centuries of weather, they can appear almost natural at first glance. Yet, these rounded hills were deliberately constructed by prehistoric communities thousands of years ago. Known as the Bougon Tumulus complex, the site contains several monumental burial structures built during different phases of the Neolithic period, beginning around 4800 BC. The monuments vary considerably. Some contain stone burial chambers reached through narrow passages. Others have different architectural forms, reflecting changes that took place over generations. Together, they reveal that the people of this region did not simply bury their dead and move on. They invested considerable effort in creating permanent places of remembrance. But why? Constructing a large tumulus required coordinated labor. Earth had to be gathered and transported. Heavy stones had to be selected, positioned, and incorporated into carefully designed chambers. Such work suggests that these communities possessed systems of cooperation strong enough to organize substantial communal projects. Inside the monuments, archaeologists have recovered human remains, pottery, stone tools, ornaments, and other objects associated with funerary activity. These discoveries provide valuable clues about Neolithic society, but they do not offer a complete explanation of the ceremonies that once took place there. A burial object may have been a personal possession. It may have been an offering. It may have been used during the ceremony itself. The original meaning is rarely certain. The architecture creates similar questions. Narrow passages lead inward from the open landscape toward enclosed chambers, creating a deliberate movement from light into darkness. Was this simply an efficient architectural design, or did the transition carry symbolic significance? The answer remains uncertain. Bougon belongs to a much wider tradition of Neolithic monumental construction found across Western Europe. Communities in distant regions developed their own forms of tombs, passage graves, dolmens, and earthworks. Some similarities may reflect cultural contact, while others could have developed independently as agricultural societies became more settled and socially complex. The dead may have played an important role in this transformation. A monumental tomb could preserve ancestral identity and strengthen a community's connection to a particular territory. The people buried inside may have become symbols of family continuity long after their individual lives had ended. Yet, the monuments could also have expressed social status. Not every person necessarily received the same treatment. The size and complexity of a tomb may have reflected the importance of particular individuals, families, or groups. In that sense, the landscape itself could become a record of social relationships. But there is no inscription explaining what the builders intended. No surviving text identifies the people who raised the stones. No written account describes the rituals. Archaeologists are left with fragments: bones, pottery, architecture, soil, and stone. And those fragments reveal something remarkable. The builders understood that a human life could be given a lasting physical presence within the landscape. Thousands of years later, the mounds still mark the same ground. The settlements that surrounded them disappeared. Languages changed. Cultures transformed. The original ceremonies ceased, yet the monuments remained. Perhaps that endurance was precisely their purpose. Or perhaps the people who built Bougon never imagined that their work would survive for so many millennia. Today, the complex stands quietly among the fields of western France, its chambers preserving only fragments of the world that created them. The evidence tells us that generations returned to this landscape and invested extraordinary effort in honoring the dead. But what did they believe they were preserving? Were these monuments places of mourning, ancestral memory, social authority, ritual gathering, or all of these at once? The stones cannot answer directly. They can only preserve the traces. And somewhere within those dark chambers and massive earthen mounds, the original meaning of Bougon remains partly beyond our reach, waiting for archaeology to uncover what time has left behind. From the quiet, prehistoric landscapes of the Bougon Tumulus complex, where enormous mounds preserve the memory of communities separated from us by thousands of years, our journey now turns toward the rugged highlands of Central Asia. Here, scattered across valleys and open steppe, burial mounds form another enduring record of prehistoric societies whose lives were shaped by movement, ancestry, and the demanding mountain environment. In the broad valleys of the Altai, mountains rise sharply beyond stretches of grassland and rocky ground. Rivers cut through the valleys, while distant peaks remain snow-covered for much of the year. Across this immense landscape, low stone and earth mounds appear as subtle interruptions in the terrain. Among these archaeological features are the Bash-Darash burial mounds, part of a wider funerary landscape in which successive communities mark the dead through carefully constructed monuments. At first, a burial mound seems simple: a rise of earth, a ring of stones, perhaps a burial chamber beneath the surface. But these structures represent deliberate acts requiring planning, labor, and ritual. Someone selected the location. Someone prepared the grave. Someone gathered the stones and earth. And someone decided that the burial should remain visible within the landscape. That decision raises a deeper question. What did the builders believe a monument accomplished after the funeral was over? Archaeologists studying burial mounds in the Altai have found evidence of changing funerary traditions extending across different prehistoric periods. The region was repeatedly occupied by communities whose economies, technologies, and social structures evolved over time. This makes the archaeological picture difficult to simplify. Not every mound belongs to the same culture. Not every burial followed the same ritual. And not every monument served precisely the same purpose. The mound itself can therefore be only the beginning of the investigation. Inside, researchers may encounter human remains, pottery, ornaments, weapons, tools, animal remains, or traces of wooden structures. Each discovery provides another clue about the person buried there and the community responsible for the monument. A weapon might indicate a particular social role. An ornament might reveal identity or status. Animal remains might represent food, sacrifice, or ritual activity. But interpretation requires caution. An object placed beside a body does not automatically reveal why it was selected. The same artifact could carry different meanings depending on the community, period, and circumstances of the burial. The Altai environment adds another dimension. For thousands of years, this region served as a meeting ground between mountain communities and the peoples of the Eurasian steppe. Routes through valleys and passes allowed people, animals, materials, and ideas to move across enormous distances. A burial monument could therefore mark more than an individual. It could preserve a family's relationship with a particular place. For mobile communities, this may have been especially important. People could travel seasonally with their herds, following pasture and water, while ancestral graves remained fixed. The tomb became an anchor. It connected a moving community to a landscape. This may help explain why burial monuments appear so frequently across the steppe and mountain regions of Eurasia. Yet, the precise social meaning of the Bash-Darash mounds remains difficult to establish. Were they primarily family tombs, markers of social rank, territorial monuments, places for repeated ceremonies, or did they combine several functions? The evidence does not provide a single answer. More speculative interpretations sometimes connect monumental burial landscapes with elaborate astronomical systems or long-distance migrations. The open horizons of the Altai naturally invite such ideas. The movements of the sun, moon, and stars would have been visible with extraordinary clarity, and seasonal knowledge was essential to communities living in such an environment. But visibility does not prove astronomical purpose. A particular orientation may reflect ritual convention, geography, practical construction, or deliberate observation of celestial events. Without stronger evidence, it is difficult to distinguish intention from coincidence. The same caution applies to theories proposing that the Altai burial mounds preserve evidence of an unknown advanced society. The archaeological record does not require such an explanation. The craftsmanship, organization, and technology visible in these monuments can be understood within the capabilities of prehistoric communities. Their achievements are significant precisely because they were accomplished with the tools and resources available to them. Perhaps the more revealing mystery concerns social organization. A substantial mound represents collective effort. How was that effort coordinated? Did a powerful individual command labor, Or did families cooperate through shared obligations? Did the construction strengthen political authority? Could funerals themselves have served as occasions for alliances between different communities? These questions are difficult to answer because the written record is absent. The builders left monuments, not explanations. Human remains can sometimes provide additional evidence. Modern archaeological methods can reveal information about diet, health, mobility, ancestry, and biological relationships. An individual buried in the Altai may have spent part of their life somewhere else. That possibility can transform the interpretation of a tomb. A burial, once viewed as evidence of a completely local community, may instead reveal a network of movement extending across the steppe. The Altai was not an isolated world. It was connected to wider Eurasian landscapes through migration, exchange, marriage, pastoral movement, and cultural interaction. The burial mounds preserve traces of those connections, even when the people who made them remain anonymous. There is also the question of why certain places were chosen. A mound positioned near a river, mountain, or route may have been visible to people moving through the landscape. Its location could have served as a landmark as well as a funerary monument. The dead could therefore become part of the geography. Travelers passed them. Herders saw them. Later generations may have recognized them as markers of ancestral presence. A landscape filled with burial monuments would have carried memories that were physically impossible to ignore. Yet, memory changes. A monument may survive after its original meaning has been lost. Later communities can encounter an old mound without knowing who constructed it or why. They may reuse it, disturb it, or incorporate it into new traditions. Over centuries, the landscape accumulates layers of human interpretation. This creates another difficulty for archaeology. A mound visible today may not look exactly as it did when first constructed. Stone rings can collapse. Earth can erode. Burials can be disturbed. Later activity can alter the surface, and earlier excavations may have removed artifacts before modern archaeological methods were available. The surviving evidence is therefore only part of the original picture. Still, the mounds tell us something fundamental. The communities that built them considered certain deaths important enough to reshape the ground itself. They transformed soil and stone into monuments. They created physical boundaries between the ordinary landscape and a place associated with the dead. And they left those monuments for future generations to encounter. Perhaps this was an expression of ancestry. Perhaps it was a declaration of belonging. Perhaps it demonstrated the importance of the individual or family. Or perhaps the ceremony had meanings that cannot be reconstructed from physical evidence alone. Today, the Altai remains a landscape of extraordinary scale. The mountains continue to dominate the horizon. The rivers still cross the valleys, and the grasslands continue to change with the seasons. The monuments are quieter. Their builders are gone. Their languages are largely silent. Their beliefs survive only through fragments. And yet the burial mounds remain remarkably eloquent. They tell us that people lived here, moved through these valleys, formed communities, honored their dead, and invested labor in monuments intended to endure. The Bash-Darash mounds therefore leave us with a question that archaeology can approach, but not completely resolve. Were these monuments primarily intended for the dead, or were they equally important to the living who gathered around them? Perhaps their true purpose lay somewhere between memory, identity, territory, and ritual. The earth has preserved the shape of the monument. The stones preserve the effort of its construction. The graves preserve traces of individual lives. But the meaning that connected all of these elements has largely disappeared. And somewhere beneath those quiet rises in the Altai, another fragment of that lost meaning may still remain, waiting for the next excavation, the next analysis, or the next discovery to bring it a little closer to the surface. In southern Costa Rica, where the Taraba and Sierpe rivers spread through broad wetlands before reaching the Pacific, the landscape can appear almost overwhelming. Dense vegetation crowds the waterways. Mountains rise beyond the lowlands. Seasonal floods reshape the edges of fields and forests, while the tropical climate steadily works against anything built by human hands. Yet, beneath this living landscape lies evidence of a sophisticated, prehistoric world. The Diquís Delta was once home to substantial communities associated with the Diquís culture, whose settlements flourished in the southern Pacific region of Costa Rica during the centuries before European contact. Their remains include raised mounds, plazas, residential areas, cemeteries, and some of the most remarkable stone objects ever produced in the Americas. The best known are the Diquís stone spheres. Almost perfectly rounded, sometimes weighing several tons, these enormous objects were shaped from hard stone and carefully polished. Their precision is striking, but the spheres are only one part of a much larger archaeological puzzle. The settlements themselves may tell us more. Archaeologists have identified artificial mounds and carefully organized spaces, suggesting that communities deliberately reshaped portions of the delta. Earth was moved. Elevated platforms were constructed. Residential areas were arranged around communal spaces. Such work required labor, and labor requires organization. Who coordinated these projects? Were they directed by hereditary leaders, influential families, or collective groups whose authority depended upon cooperation? The archaeological evidence suggests that Diquís society was socially complex, with distinctions in status and access to valuable objects. Gold ornaments, elaborate ceramics, and carefully constructed burial areas indicate that social identity mattered deeply. But the settlements do not provide a simple picture of centralized rule. Instead, they appear to represent communities connected through shared traditions, exchange, political relationships, and perhaps competing centers of influence. The stone spheres fit naturally into this world. For decades, their extraordinary geometry encouraged speculation about their purpose. Some have proposed that they represented the sun, celestial bodies, political authority, or elements of a cosmological system. Others have suggested that their arrangement reflected astronomical observations. The most conventional interpretation is more restrained. The spheres may have served as symbols of status, power, identity, or social affiliation. Their production required considerable effort, and objects demanding such investment often carry meanings beyond their physical function. But there is an important problem. Many spheres were removed from their original locations long before archaeologists could properly document their surroundings. Some were relocated to public spaces. Others were moved onto private properties. Some archaeological contexts were disturbed by agriculture, construction, and looting. As a result, researchers are often left studying the object without the landscape that once explained it. This distinction is crucial. A sphere standing alone tells us that someone created it. A sphere positioned beside a particular mound, within a plaza, or near a burial tells us something about how that object was used. Context transforms an artifact into evidence. Without it, interpretation becomes much more uncertain. The settlements themselves provide another clue. The Diquís people did not simply occupy the landscape. They modified it. Raised mounds could provide dry and elevated surfaces within a wet environment. Plazas created open communal spaces. Paths and carefully arranged structures helped organize movement through settlements. Architecture may therefore have carried social meaning. A larger mound could signal importance. A central plaza could create a place for gatherings and ceremonies. The positioning of houses could reflect relationships between families or social groups. And monumental objects placed within these spaces could reinforce the hierarchy of the community. The delta was also connected to a much wider region. Materials and artistic styles indicate exchange extending beyond the immediate settlements. Gold-working traditions, ceramics, stone objects, and other materials reveal contact between communities separated by considerable distances. This means the Diquís Delta was not an isolated pocket of human activity. It belonged to a broader network. Ideas could travel, craft techniques could spread, people could move between communities, marriage could create alliances. Trade could carry valuable materials across rivers and mountain routes. The spheres may have participated in this same system of interaction. Perhaps their importance was partly political. A powerful leader might use monumental objects to demonstrate the ability to organize skilled labor. A community might position spheres to mark an important gathering place. Several spheres together might express relationships between neighboring groups. But none of these interpretations can yet explain every example. Their meaning may also have changed through time. A monument created for one generation could acquire a different significance for another. An object associated with political authority might later become connected with ancestral memory. A ceremonial space could eventually become a burial area. The archaeological landscape is not static. It accumulates meaning as generations interact with it. The eventual decline of the Diquís settlements adds another layer of uncertainty. By the time Europeans entered the region, the societies that had created these monumental landscapes had already experienced substantial political and demographic changes. There was no single event that simply erased the settlements. Environmental pressures, shifting political relationships, population changes, and regional transformations may all have contributed. Later, European conquest brought disease, warfare, displacement, and profound disruption to indigenous societies throughout the region. The old settlement systems were no longer maintained in the same way. Vegetation gradually reclaimed portions of the landscape. Structures deteriorated. River sediments accumulated, and the monumental spheres remained as some of the clearest surviving traces of the communities that created them. Today, the Diquís Delta presents archaeologists with an unusual combination of certainty and uncertainty. There is no doubt that complex communities lived here. There is no doubt that they organized substantial construction projects. There is no doubt that skilled craftspeople produced remarkably precise stone spheres. There is strong evidence for regional interaction and social differentiation. What remains less certain is how all these elements fitted together. Were the settlements governed by powerful regional leaders? Did several independent communities share a common political tradition? Were the spheres primarily symbols of authority, ritual objects, territorial markers, or expressions of something that modern archaeology has not yet recognized? Perhaps their meaning cannot be reduced to a single purpose. A monument can represent power and ancestry at the same time. A ceremonial object can also communicate social status. A carefully arranged landscape can function as both a gathering place and a political statement. That complexity may explain why the Diquís Delta continues to resist a simple interpretation. The tropical landscape has preserved fragments, but not explanations. Stone survives. Earth survives. Burials survive. The arrangement of an ancient settlement can sometimes be reconstructed, but the beliefs that once connected these elements have largely disappeared. And so, among the rivers and forests of southern Costa Rica, the archaeological record leaves us with an enduring question. When the people of the Diquís Delta placed their great stone spheres within carefully organized settlements, were they marking authority, honoring ancestors, expressing a vision of the cosmos, or communicating something more specific to their own communities? The evidence allows several possibilities. None fully closes the case. And beneath the vegetation, soil, and centuries of change, there may still be settlements whose arrangement could provide the missing context, perhaps revealing not only how the spheres were made, but why these remarkable communities believed they needed them at all. In the southeastern part of Malta, not far from the monumental Tarxien temples, the ground conceals traces of a prehistoric burial landscape associated with one of the island's most distinctive archaeological traditions. The area is known as the Tarxien Cemetery. Unlike the massive limestone temples that dominate discussions of Malta's prehistoric past, this site is less visually dramatic. There are no towering walls rising intact above the surrounding landscape. Instead, its significance lies in what archaeologists have recovered from the soil: human remains, burial evidence, pottery, and traces of funerary activity belonging to communities that lived thousands of years ago. And the closer researchers look, the more complicated the story becomes. Malta's prehistoric temple culture developed over a remarkably long period. Monumental structures were being constructed on the islands from roughly the 4th millennium BC, while later communities continued to modify and reuse important locations. The Tarxien Cemetery belongs to a later phase of this prehistoric sequence. Its archaeological evidence is associated with the Tarxien Cemetery phase, generally placed around the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. This period followed the great temple-building tradition that had transformed Malta and Gozo into landscapes filled with monumental architecture. But the people who came after those earlier builders did not simply abandon the old world. They appear to have inherited elements of its material culture while developing different funerary practices. That transition is important. Archaeologists often expect cultures to change gradually, but Malta presents an especially striking case because the islands were relatively small and geographically isolated. For prehistoric communities living here, movement across the sea was possible, but contact with distant populations was not necessarily constant. So, when cultural practices changed, where did those influences come from? And what happened to the communities that had created the great temples? The cemetery provides only fragments of an answer. Human remains offer evidence of individual lives. Bones can reveal age, sex, health, physical stress, and sometimes patterns of diet or mobility. Pottery and other objects can help establish chronology and cultural connections. But a burial is more than a collection of artifacts. It represents a deliberate decision about how the dead should be treated. That decision can reveal values that are otherwise invisible. Some prehistoric societies buried individuals with personal possessions. Others emphasized collective burial. Some reopened tombs repeatedly, moving bones or adding new individuals over generations. Others maintained strict distinctions between particular members of the community. The evidence from Malta suggests that funerary customs were changing during the period associated with the cemetery. That raises a larger question. Was this simply an evolution in local ritual practice, or did it reflect a deeper transformation in Maltese society? The answer is difficult to establish because the archaeological record does not preserve written explanations. There are no surviving accounts describing who was buried here. No inscription identifies the community. No text explains what happened during the ceremonies. Instead, researchers must reconstruct the past from physical traces. This becomes especially important when considering the relationship between the cemetery and the nearby temples. The Tarxien temples themselves contain evidence of ritual activity, animal remains, carved stonework, altars, and architectural features associated with ceremonial practices. The later cemetery was therefore located within a landscape already carrying enormous cultural significance. Could the location have retained an ancestral meaning? Perhaps. A place associated with generations of ritual activity might remain important even after its original religious practices changed. Alternatively, the cemetery may simply reflect practical use of an established settlement area. Archaeology cannot always distinguish between sacred continuity and convenient reuse. This uncertainty has encouraged broader speculation about Malta's prehistoric population. The extraordinary temples have sometimes inspired theories involving advanced knowledge, astronomical observation, or contacts with distant cultures. Some interpretations go much further, suggesting that the island's monumental architecture reflects an external influence or a forgotten technological tradition. There is little evidence requiring such explanations. The stoneworking, architecture, and funerary practices can be understood through the capabilities of Neolithic and Copper Age communities. Yet, the conventional explanation does not make the society any less remarkable. In the southeastern part of Malta, not far from the monumental Tarxien temples, the ground conceals traces of a prehistoric burial landscape associated with one of the island's most distinctive archaeological traditions. The area is known as the Tarxien Cemetery. Unlike the massive limestone temples that dominate discussions of Malta's prehistoric past, this site is less visually dramatic. There are no towering walls rising intact above the surrounding landscape. Instead, its significance lies in what archaeologists have recovered from the soil: human remains, burial evidence, pottery, and traces of funerary activity belonging to communities that lived thousands of years ago. And the closer researchers look, the more complicated the story becomes. Malta's prehistoric temple culture developed over a remarkably long period. Monumental structures were being constructed on the islands from roughly the 4th millennium BC, while later communities continued to modify and reuse important locations. The Tarxien Cemetery belongs to a later phase of this prehistoric sequence. Its archaeological evidence is associated with the Tarxien Cemetery phase, generally placed around the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. This period followed the great temple-building tradition that had transformed Malta and Gozo into landscapes filled with monumental architecture. But the people who came after those earlier builders did not simply abandon the old world. They appear to have inherited elements of its material culture while developing different funerary practices. That transition is important. Archaeologists often expect cultures to change gradually, but Malta presents an especially striking case because the islands were relatively small and geographically isolated. For prehistoric communities living here, movement across the sea was possible, but contact with distant populations was not necessarily constant. So, when cultural practices changed, where did those influences come from? And what happened to the communities that had created the great temples? The cemetery provides only fragments of an answer. Human remains offer evidence of individual lives. Bones can reveal age, sex, health, physical stress, and sometimes patterns of diet or mobility. Pottery and other objects can help establish chronology and cultural connections. But a burial is more than a collection of artifacts. It represents a deliberate decision about how the dead should be treated. That decision can reveal values that are otherwise invisible. Some prehistoric societies buried individuals with personal possessions. Others emphasized collective burial. Some reopened tombs repeatedly, moving bones or adding new individuals over generations. Others maintained strict distinctions between particular members of the community. The evidence from Malta suggests that funerary customs were changing during the period associated with the cemetery. That raises a larger question. Was this simply an evolution in local ritual practice, or did it reflect a deeper transformation in Maltese society? The answer is difficult to establish because the archaeological record does not preserve written explanations. There are no surviving accounts describing who was buried here. No inscription identifies the community. No text explains what happened during the ceremonies. Instead, researchers must reconstruct the past from physical traces. This becomes especially important when considering the relationship between the cemetery and the nearby temples. The Tarxien temples themselves contain evidence of ritual activity, animal remains, carved stonework, altars, and architectural features associated with ceremonial practices. The later cemetery was therefore located within a landscape already carrying enormous cultural significance. Could the location have retained an ancestral meaning? Perhaps. A place associated with generations of ritual activity might remain important even after its original religious practices changed. Alternatively, the cemetery may simply reflect practical use of an established settlement area. Archaeology cannot always distinguish between sacred continuity and convenient reuse. This uncertainty has encouraged broader speculation about Malta's prehistoric population. The extraordinary temples have sometimes inspired theories involving advanced knowledge, astronomical observation, or contacts with distant cultures. Some interpretations go much further, suggesting that the island's monumental architecture reflects an external influence or a forgotten technological tradition. There is little evidence requiring such explanations. The stoneworking, architecture, and funerary practices can be understood through the capabilities of Neolithic and Copper Age communities. Yet, the conventional explanation does not make the society any less remarkable. From the prehistoric burial landscape of Malta, where changing funerary customs hint at deeper transformations within island society, our journey now returns to the Iranian plateau. Far from the Mediterranean, another archaeological landscape developed around a precious resource: water. Along the Zayandeh route, settlements emerged beside a river crossing one of the driest regions of central Iran, leaving behind fragments of a prehistoric world that remains only partly understood. The Zayandeh route cuts across central Iran like a narrow thread of life through an increasingly arid landscape. Rising in the Zagros Mountains, the river travels eastward toward the Gavkuni Basin, passing through plains where fertile ground contrasts sharply with surrounding dry hills and desert. Long before the rise of Isfahan, communities were already living along parts of this river system. Their settlements were modest compared with the monumental cities of later Iranian history, but their presence reveals an important transformation. People were cultivating land, producing pottery, raising animals, burying their dead, and developing relationships with communities beyond their immediate surroundings. The river was more than a source of drinking water. It created a corridor through an otherwise difficult environment. Agriculture depended upon reliable access to water, while the surrounding landscape offered routes toward the mountains, deserts, and other inhabited regions. Over time, these advantages encouraged repeated settlement. Archaeological surveys have identified prehistoric sites within the Zayandeh route basin, including evidence connected with the Chalcolithic period. Pottery traditions found in the region have also been compared with material from southern Iran, suggesting that communities along the river participated in wider networks of contact and exchange. But what did those connections actually look like? Were people traveling between distant settlements? Were objects exchanged through several intermediary communities? Or did craftsmen simply imitate styles that had reached the region through gradual cultural contact? The pottery alone cannot answer. Yet, it demonstrates that the Zayandeh Basin was not isolated. This becomes especially important because the region occupied a strategic position within the Iranian plateau. Communities living beside the river could interact with populations in neighboring valleys while still maintaining their own local traditions. The archaeological record suggests a society that was becoming increasingly organized. Permanent or semi-permanent settlements required planning. Fields required cultivation. Animals required management. Tools and pottery required specialized knowledge. Burials required decisions about how the dead should be treated. Each individual discovery may seem ordinary, but together they reveal communities capable of coordinating many aspects of daily life. The most intriguing evidence may come from the settlements themselves. Mud brick structures have often blended into the surrounding earth, while later construction and agriculture have disturbed many archaeological layers. As a result, much of the prehistoric landscape remains difficult to reconstruct. Some sites may have been small villages. Others could have served as regional centers, and some may have been occupied only during particular periods. Without extensive excavation, distinguishing between these possibilities is difficult. Environmental change adds another complication. Rivers shift their courses. Floodplains expand and contract. Climate changes alter water availability. A settlement that once stood beside a productive channel may eventually find itself separated from the water that sustained it. Abandonment, therefore, does not necessarily indicate catastrophe. A community may simply have moved. This is where the mystery becomes more subtle. The Zayandeh Rood settlements do not require extraordinary explanations. Their existence can be understood through agriculture, environmental adaptation, and regional interaction. Yet, important questions remain. How extensive was settlement along the river during the earliest periods? How closely were these communities connected? Did they share a distinct regional identity? And how much of their social and religious world remains buried beneath the modern landscape? The answers may lie in the soil around the river itself. Every fragment of pottery, every burial, and every surviving wall provides another piece of evidence. But the people who created these settlements left no written account of their lives. Their world survives through material traces. And somewhere along the ancient course of the Zayandeh Rood, those traces may still preserve evidence capable of changing how we understand the earliest communities that made the river basin their home.